Hello and welcome to the Fresh Air Sci-Fi Show. I'm Joe.
I'm Dave.
I'm Philip.
And that'll hopefully soon be Kevin.
Yes. It seems Kevin might be having some connection difficulties. And I'd just like to say hello to Chris, Ricardo, Rev, and Danny. Great to have you here nice and early. I hope you guys are well. I hope you enjoyed. Yeah, DJ 80 Tits. Yeah, that'll work, Rev. Yeah, I actually today was going to be one of those days where I had a lot of time for a mix, and then as things happen with kids, I ended up having no time. Ended up only getting about 20 minutes, but so I decided to have a quick glitch up mix because I haven't played any glitch up in ages. It was less than optimal, but I enjoyed it all the same. So how are you guys doing? Philip, I haven't seen you on the stream in a little while.
Hey, Kevin.
He's here.
Hey,
how you
Kevin.
doing? Oh, there's no sound from you yet.
We can't hear you though. This is the first time I meet Kevin, by the way, on stream.
He's brilliant.
That's great. Yeah, but we can't.
I still can't hear you, yet, unfortunately. Yeah.
It's that terrible uni internet.
It's also the fact that what is a sci-fi stream without some form of technical difficulty going on?
That's true.
I mean, at the beginning of every stream, at least, there is something that goes wrong. Usually it's me forgetting to turn the microphones on, which it also was.
And it is usually me that has the technical error. So I'm probably responsible for Kevin's technical error.
But ultimately, we all know it's Philip. It's his magic powers.
Yeah, it's me.
Yeah.
That's well established at this point.
It's always your fault, Philip. So yeah, let's whilst Kevin's trying to sort out his issues there, tell us how you're doing, Philip. It's been a while since we've seen you.
I'm doing great. I mean, yeah, I've missed one stream, the last one, but I'm doing great. I haven't actually watched it back yet, but I'm doing great, and I'm very busy with some other things going on right now, like both from work and from other sides of my life. But other than that, it's really good.
Awesome. And I suppose the busyness is a good kind of busyness. It's not a bad.
Yeah,
kind?
it's a good kind of busyness. Yes,
that's the best kind of
business.
Yeah. Kevin, can you speak again, or are you completely mute? Is your mic gone?
Maybe
you can't hear us either.
Yeah, that seems.
That's typical, isn't it?
I've just checked the permissions in the channel, and it all seems fine.
Yeah, that shouldn't be an issue. He wouldn't be able to join otherwise. Usually, that's sort of the permission level.
Yeah, it's set up as guest. Kevin, I don't know if you can check your settings within Discord. I don't know if you can hear us, but if you check your settings within Discord, sometimes it messes about with
voice and video. Yeah, in the voice and video section, there should be an input device and output device and a camera. But the camera seems to work okay, so that.
Yeah, so one of those things. So yesterday it was Katie's birthday. So we went out and we took the bus. We had a couple of bus wankers for the evening, and we went into Bournemouth Town Centre, and we ended up going for tapas, and we did a bit of a cocktail crawl. It was all very, very nice. It was the first time that we'd been out and together without the kids in forever. So. What's too good?
I mean, the DJ skeptics that lacks beet leaves.
I completely missed that. That's brilliant.
That's pretty good. That is actually. You should seriously consider that one.
Yeah. The next mix will be called Only Lacks Beat Leafs.
Wait. Okay, wait. We can hear Kevin.
Yeah.
I think.
I think you're hearing me to my. I think I know the problem. Oh, okay, wait.
Okay, yeah, that's.
I think Oh, I found the problem.
Nice one.
Good. I found the problem. Yeah.
Yeah, we can hear you well
I found the problem. I thought it was my settings, but it was my microphone. There's this little button in it that I can use to mute, and I press it, not knowing I do.
I've got the same thing on my gaming headset actually that I also use for work calls, and it's got a little button there. It's for ages I was like, oh, my mic's not working. It's the work laptop. It works fine on my desktop. It's no, the problem was definitely in the chair. That problem was me.
I didn't realize it was pressed.
Easily done, mate. Easily done. So it's good to have you back. So I was just saying to Philip, we haven't seen you on the stream since that superhero morality stream we did around Christmas.
It's been a while.
Yeah, it's been a really, really long time. So for anyone who hasn't met you before, do you want to just tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do and your interest in philosophy?
I'm a philosophy student at UQAM, which stands for Université du Québec à Montréal, which in English translates to Montreal University of Quebec, if I'm right. It's the largest French-speaking university in North America. I'm in my last year of my bachelor, but don't let that fool you because of Quebec weird system, my bachelor is actually higher standing than an English-speaking bachelor. It's not exactly the same. Like we actually get way more content in Quebec for a bachelor. It's when elsewhere in Canada and English Canada, it's more like a major, which is not my case. I get way more.
Ah, fair. So
I'm more at master level, to be honest, because I'm technically already done with my bachelor philosophy courses. I only have optional classes now.
And how long have you been doing the purely optional ones?
Oh, I started this semester. I have like one mandatory class left, and the rest was only optional. And next semester is also optional classes. And I started my internship for teaching too.
Oh,
nice one.
So are you planning on becoming a philosophy teacher?
Yeah, at university if possible, but college level is still on the table too.
No, I've got a challenge for you. You need to make sure philosophy is taught in primary school all around the world. That's your challenge.
That would be great.
If we even get it to high school level, it'd be good enough for me.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. I do think, we've had this discussion a few times that things like ethics and critical thinking and logic should really be taught, even in a basic way in primary school.
I didn't tell you that, but I chose what topic I will do for my master. I will write about meta-philosophy.
Nice one.
Okay.
Meta-philosophy.
Yeah, which is philosophy about philosophy.
The philosophy of philosophy.
Yeah. Awesome.
Which is relevant for today's topic because
it's very
philosophy we're doing.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And also, your philosophy is a little bit different to sort of the philosophy Dave has studied as well, isn't it? Yours is a little bit more continental leaning.
It's more diverse, to be honest, because Quebec is sit in between English and French traditions because of the history of Quebec, which was a French colony that was conquered by the English, and now it's a bit in between. This explains that my courses also are in between. I get a good mix of analytical and continental philosophy, which I don't really like Thurston because, as my teachers told us, it's more as a sociological divide more than a philosophical one, if you think about it.
Yeah.
But it's accurate enough, I guess.
That's fair. I think the bulk of it to really dumb down the difference is the way it's written.
More or less. Because the topics often are the same. It's just written differently.
Yeah. And there's a lot you can glean from both. So obviously tonight's video is a video by AntiCitizen X, and he's done one called The Stagnation of Philosophy. Now, I haven't watched this video. I've heard some negative things. I've heard some even things about this video, but from what I can see, I mean, I've not heard anything from AntiCitizen X before, but it seems that he does a lot of philosophy himself. Looking at his channel, there's a lot of philosophy videos and things like that. So I would take
did a background check on him, to be honest. I did a bit of a background check on him. Yeah, but I think if I understood correctly, he only did a major in philosophy, and since then he hates philosophy, pretty much.
Right. Okay. So I mean, I've heard mixed things about this guy. So I'm really quite clueless as to him. It seems like there's, well, regardless of whether he likes philosophy or not, there's a lot of philosophical content on his page, and his blog is something called like Philosophy Engineered or something like that. So, you know, for someone that hates philosophy, using the term philosophy, it seems a bit weird as well. But hey, whatever. Now, what I did ask for the people in the chat room to do is to try and keep us honest with this video. Keep up. Let us know when our biases are going on. Kevin, there's a bit of background noise coming through on your microphone at the moment. Might be the sensitivity or something. But yes.
Deactivate. Okay, wait a second. We're just.
It seems okay all of a sudden now, but oh no, it's because you pressed mute. So obviously the four of us quite like philosophy, but we often say that we should be critiquing our own. So we want to listen to this with as open mind as we can, but all four of us have a bias. We've got two of us in here that study philosophy. Obviously, Dave studied and has got a master's. And Kevin, you've got your weird master, non-master degree going on.
Higher than the bachelor, but still technically. I guess I'm like first master Dave background.
Yeah, fair.
Technically at that level.
That's fair. And obviously you've got Philip, who mainly interested in things like logic and philosophy of religion, aren't you?
Yeah, like I would say so. Like I got into philosophy, I guess. Actually, I was always interested in philosophy to some extent, even as a kid. But what pulled me back into philosophy was mainly philosophy of religion, I guess. Logic as well, because of my sort of tangential interests, I guess. It was something that I focused on a lot for some time. And more recently, I also quite enjoy philosophy of mind and sort of like that area.
And I mean, I'm as probably unqualified as they come, but I've been doing these streams. I really enjoy philosophy. There's a lot of content that I find piques my interest, but the main thing that I keep coming back to is morality. I love ethics. Also interested in logic and epistemology and stuff like that. But ethics is the main thing that I'm really interested in, and they're the articles that I'm reading. I find that I get really into, and I read again and again and again and try and understand more than anything else. Other things I read and I go, but I enjoy these conversations. I enjoy all the philosophical chat that we have, and learning something new every week as well. It's brilliant, and I'm essentially, I've got a straw into Dave's brain, and I suck it out little by little.
And Kevin's now.
Yeah, one of us, part of the ship, part of the crew. So, I think if you guys are ready and there's nothing we need to do. Oh, Steen, how you doing? Nice to see you here as well. Sorry, I didn't see you come into the chat. Ricardo, what is morality? I can give you some videos, but if you ask that question and I answer it, we'll be here all night having a conversation about morality and not addressing tonight's video. The short answer is principles of good and bad, right and wrong behavior. We'll leave it at that. So I'm just going to literally throw things into Be Right Back so I can get the video up, and we will get on with the rest of the stream.
I forgot to actually rewatch the video, so...
Well, that's good.
I haven't watched the video. Like, I watched the first couple of minutes, I think, and that was it, because I thought... Yeah, so it's going to be interesting to see the rest of it.
Because all the philosophy is just footnotes to Plato, it's obvious that it's stagnated.
So just to answer one question... how much of an arsehole can one be before getting blocked? I very, very rarely block anyone. It's only if someone harasses me, I tend to block them. So there's only like a couple of people I've really ever blocked. As for being an arsehole, I mean, I'm probably the biggest arsehole here, so...
I think he was asking about how much he can push with comments before getting blocked. That was the intent, I think, behind
Yeah,
that.
I took that as well. And we're generally quite liberal in that regard. And if ever there's a point where you need to shut up, I'll tell you.
By liberal, he means too lazy to actually push the buttons to block anybody.
Yeah, there is that too. So, this is tonight's video, the Stagnation of Philosophy by AntiCitizen X. So, his little blurb on this is, academic philosophy has a serious problem. There are no official standards by which we can differentiate between good philosophy and bad philosophy. The result is an intellectual free-for-all that needlessly promotes misinformation and competence. And from that little blurb, I'm already disagreeing, but let's actually watch the video and see how true that comment is to what he actually says. Oh, there's no sound.
I can hear it.
I can't.
I can.
That's very weird.
No, I know what I've done. I have actually set up my sound settings a bit weird. So it's coming through the virtual audio cable rather than my headset. So that should have changed it. Let me just check.
Imagine getting into medical school and sitting down for your very first day of class. As a scholarly-looking professor approaches the lectern, you eagerly get out your pen and paper in anticipation for all the amazing knowledge coming your way. Welcome to the foundations of medicine, says the professor. I hope you're all as excited as I am to explore the vast, wonderful world of healing. At first,
I think he's a South Park fan.
It does seem that way, doesn't it? Well, that's good, because I am a South Park fan myself. And I haven't seen the last couple of seasons because I've just been too busy, but yeah.
Normally, but it's not long before you notice an unsettling trend. Rather than just teach students about the modern understanding of the human body, the instructor seems to fixate on the strangest of topics. For weeks, you suffer through lecture after lecture on wholly discredited practices like bloodletting, trepanation, phrenology, and homeopathy. Eventually, about halfway through the semester, the professor seems to settle down with more sensible topics like cell biology and the germ theory of disease, but it doesn't last. Before you know it, you're suddenly delving right back into the medicinal theories of feng shui, acupuncture, and demon possession. Baffled by this outcome, you begin to wonder, was this class some sort of outlier? Maybe the university just wants to give students some historical context before teaching the real, practical stuff. So you decide to take a look at the undergraduate catalog, and, strangely enough, the entire School of Medicine is like this. In order to officially earn your medical credentials, you must endure such classes as medicine and literature, God, faith and healing, women in early oncology, medieval pharmacology, meta-medicine, Eastern ophthalmology, medical justice, spirituality in cardiology, survey of early modern medicine. After investigating even further, you eventually come to learn that this isn't even a local phenomenon. It's a widespread practice among every accredited medical school across the Western world. Surely, given such a predicament, the only sensible response is to drop the entire ordeal and change majors, right? Sensible, that is, for anyone but a philosophy major. This may seem like a far-fetched scenario, but it really is how modern philosophy is taught at the college level.
Guys, seeing as there are two of you who have been taught at a college level, can you verify if that's how it's actually taught?
Doesn't resemble anything that I learned.
There is a...
Sorry, you're cutting out there, Kevin. Yeah. You might need to turn your mic back up a little bit.
Oh, it's too low now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I tried to lower for the interface. Now it's good. Is it better now?
Yeah,
it's much better now.
Okay, it's back to where it was before. So I said there's an inkling of truth to what it says, because it's true that when we teach philosophy, we teach it usually in an historical manner, and we do teach it the way we do teach is sometimes confusing to new students, because we do teach a lot of weird stuff. Like when you read Aristotle and you learn that Aristotle defended slavery, you can wonder, why do we even read this guy, right? Because he defended slavery. And you can take the same kind of thing with most philosophers, because nearly every one of them defended something dumb, weird, or odd, or just factually wrong now. Like Descartes defended a few weird philosophical ideas in physics, but he's still one of the most important physicists in the world. Like most of the optics and geometry is still relevant, dependent on what he elaborated on at the time. But that's beside the point. My point is, he has some inkling of truth to what he says, but it's a misunderstanding and a misrepresentation of what is a class of philosophy, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's more the concepts that's being learned, not the history of bad philosophy, kind of like how that looks in the beginning of the video. Like, you'll learn what Plato argued, what Socrates argued, and stuff like that. But you're looking at the concepts and breaking the concepts down, and you go through the history of who argued what and how it became what and things like that. Or at least that's how we learned.
And as you will see, he makes a few assumptions that just doesn't make sense for philosophy. For example, we'll compare it a lot to science, which he already did by comparing it to medicine. But we'll go further in this comparison. And it doesn't work because he assumed that, first of all, he made two mistakes. One, he assumed that science is only progressing, which is the myth of progress, which you probably heard about. First of all, he did that. But then he tried to apply it to philosophy and says, well, philosophy keep going back to those old ideas. It doesn't seem to progress. So it's not a real science. So it's kind of stupid. It's worthless. It's meaningless. And he will try to argue that point. But it starts this way. Start by saying, oh, philosophy teach you a bunch of outdated ideas. So what's the point?
It's sort of like in... Sorry, I was just going to say it's sort of like an apples to Star Trek kind of comparison. Like two completely different things.
That was my biggest... Like, as I said, this is the only part of the video that I watched, right? The initial comparison, and then like I wasn't that interested in the thing, so I just was curious to see the first bit. And then I planned to get back onto it, and I'm doing it now, but I never really then got back
it goes on like that. It's very repetitive, to be honest.
Yeah, the point is, like, this is, I think, you nailed it both, right? I think that the main problem from this segment here is that he's comparing the whole thing to sort of a scientific field, right? Where you have a certain...
It's not wrong in itself. It's just the way he does it is wrong.
Yeah, I don't know, because like to me this is unfair, because the things philosophy deals with do not have the same ways to be sort of benchmarked that science or scientific things have, right? Like, and this might be, you might say, oh well, then it's useless, right? But it's more like about what's like, it's more about what philosophy talks about, essentially, right? Like it's the content of what philosophy deals with that is such that it's harder for you to get these sorts of hard lines in the sand, right? Whereas with science, it's easier to do these things. But that's not a problem with, like, you can compare these two, like, as if they were standing on the same ground and working with the same material. They're working with different things. And this is, I think, the biggest problem with this initial comparison.
I don't agree entirely with your point, because you're kind of making his argument that philosophy doesn't make progress, that it doesn't forward ideas, which it does. And that's the problem.
It does.
Thinks
absolutely.
that ideas doesn't progress in philosophy, which they do. For example, I mentioned on Twitter, I think you probably read it, Dave, when I said that philosophy has kind of settled a few debates for itself, at least. Not that we don't bring back the debates for fun sometime, but some debates are pretty settled in philosophy. For example, abortion debate is very settled in philosophy. We don't talk about it. It's a good example. It's very clear cut. Most philosophers would tell you they are for abortion. They are for it because they think there is no morally a grandstanding argument against it now. It's very difficult to make one. You can make one, but it's more difficult. And there are other debates like that. For example, if you say philosophers about free will, most philosophers will either take a compatibilist stance, which means you think, yes, determinism is inevitable, we cannot ignore it. We can still make the case for free will in a matter that it's compatible with that.
In a compatibilism way, yeah.
Or you will argue that it doesn't matter either way. That even if free will doesn't exist at all, we still have the illusion of free will, which makes it, which imposes itself in our lives. So who cares? That's one of the two most popular stances nowadays, and it's pretty settled, to be so to speak.
Also, I mean, is there really any real issue with actually learning where some of the ideas came from and how they evolved out over the years, and also looking back and going, this idea is still pretty strong. Yes, some of their ideas were clearly wrong, but actually, there's a few.
Making, right?
Sorry,
that's the argument. Isn't that the argument he's making by saying that what would be the point of teaching old, discarded medicine for for new future doctors? He thinks that's a waste of time because you only have so much time to learn. So why teach the antiquated ideas? That's what he's arguing about.
But then some doctors do actually learn a couple of different methods to deal with the same problem. You know, if you're out in the field, there might be a different methodology to do something than if you're in a hospital, and you know, depending on you know, the sort of injury and how quick you need to act, you do need to learn different methodologies. And you know, field medicine, like in a war, is a bit different to how it would be.
But they're not teaching you trepanation and bloodletting, which is kind of the example he gave.
That's true. But then do you find that there are how much philosophy is actually taught where you actually, I mean, you might address some of the bad ideas, but how much is drawn where you focus on it and go, yeah, this is all the stuff that's actually wrong. We're going to focus on the stuff that's wrong. Or does it more sort of come up in the way that this is the current lines of thinking. There's this, and this. There were other ideas. If you're interested in them, you can look at them here. This is basically what they're doing, sort of just glossing over it. I mean, how is it like that? Is it like that, or is it?
Philosophy does progress?
Sorry, what was that, Kevin?
You mean all philosophy does progress?
No. I was saying, like, in your coursework, you know, whilst you might be addressing the foundations and things that come on, how much focus is actually given, say, in your course, to ideas that have been completely discarded?
A lot, actually, because one of the things that Plato was wrong about, to be honest, is that Plato and a few philosophers like him believe that there is no benefit to learning falsehoods, which is wrong. Because if you've ever been a teacher or ever worked with one, you will know that falsehoods are necessary to learn. For example, the very concept of a test, which, for example, with false and true question, is to learn to identify what is true and false better. And to identify, and when you have incomplete sentences, it's to identify what's lacking for the truth, right? And so on. So actually, the very way of learning implied to recognize what is a falsehood by being exposed to falsehoods. So falsehoods are very important to learn the truth.
So in that regard, you're learning from someone's mistakes.
Yeah, and your own mistakes too.
Yeah. So I mean,
I'm not sure. Yes.
Sorry, go for it, Philip.
No. I just wanted to ask Kevin, because I wasn't able to hear before. Did you say that, like, when What were you arguing that if you treat philosophy and science differently, because as I think they talk about different things, do you think that I'm making kind of his argument? Is that
Somewhat.
what you would say?
Somewhat, yes, somewhat.
Like,
but the thing is, you're not. I agree with you that philosophy and science are different in many important ways. But on the point that actually matters and the one that is trying to discredit, I don't think you're that different. Because the point, the Stan Orvey's argument is saying that if philosophy is concerned about truth and knowledge, which he will talk about a bit later, then philosophy is doing a very bad job at it. That's what he's going to say. So we can continue.
Okay.
We'll just get to
it. I disagree with that. I just wanted to ask you, I guess, do you think that philosophy and science are at the same rate of progress in general? Like that they work at the same rate of progress?
That's a tough question.
Roughly speaking. Because I personally don't think that they do. I do think that science moves much faster than philosophy. Like I have no issue in saying that. And I also don't think, for example, that compatibilism is as strongly accepted as some sort of scientific views that we have, right? Like certain scientific views are much stronger established than compatibilism or any of the examples that you mentioned. I mean, that doesn't mean that there's no consensus, right? I do think that there's a strong consensus on the topics that you mentioned, but I do think that these sorts of comparisons that I pointed out and that you pointed out as well do show that there is a different they're just different in this way, I think. But that, like, what I disagree with is the bridge between saying, oh, these are different, therefore philosophy is worth less or is worthless. Like that's the sort of step of reasoning that I take issue with. Not the step before where they actually, or he does point out then that science and philosophy do progress at different speeds and do have different standards of sort of how sure we are about certain things. So like that would be roughly how I would approach this.
I'd say that you're right that philosophy doesn't progress at the same speed, but I think that's a misnomer because science seems to progress faster, but does it actually progress faster? Think about it. For centuries, we have theories upon theories that build up, and then at some point you can get a new scientist and say, oh, turned out everything you thought was true was wrong, and we start over. That's still progress, but you have a big setback and everything that we thought was true. And that can happen sometimes in science. It's supposed to happen, actually. But the thing is, it doesn't happen that often, which means that for a while, we think we are progressing at a steady pace until we hit that roadblock, which set it back with a new theory, a new framework, and then we start again. So science is like that. It goes very fast, hit a wall, goes back, and goes again. Philosophy is more at the fact that it's more inch by inch, but it never goes back really far. It only ever goes forward, or it never went anywhere. If you want to say it that way, I guess. But it doesn't really apply because we don't progress in the same manner, I think. And the topics we touch, as you said, don't really bring themselves to comparison. Like, can you compare moral debates to scientific debates? Not usually.
No, you can't. I think that's the main issue of the whole.
But even epistemology, you cannot compare an epistemological debate to scientific debate because
you can't.
Scientific debate is done with a set and decided epistemological framework. You already agree with the epistemology. Technically, you're supposed to. And in the epistemological framework, you start by principles, which are very difficult to work for. Because you need to petition a principle. It's different.
Yes. That I absolutely agree with that.
Would you guys say that science is more concise in its methodology as well? Like philosophy is more open, it's a broader topic, or would you say science is just as broad as philosophy, or would you say it's broader?
It's more restrained by nature.
Sorry?
I say it's more restrained by definition. It already take for granted a few epistemological framework by necessity. If you don't believe in empiricism, well, science is impossible to begin with. So you already have to accept a few principles, the same way you do in philosophy for any argument, right? What we do in philosophy, which we switch those principles depending on what we are arguing about and who is arguing. But in science, you can't do that. You can just say, okay, today we're empiricists and tomorrow we're not. You cannot do that. You can't.
Yeah, but then also, like, so I think in science there's this huge advantage, as we talked about, because it's about sort of empirical things usually, right? They can be very, I mean, the experiments themselves, require some time to be constructed, but once you have them, right, they're designed in such a way that, whatever data that you get is designed to sort of confirm and disconfirm like competing theories. But that's easy because the material that you work with is empirical, right? And you can have certain answers from sort of just observation that you cannot have when you talk about sort of abstract things that are like come before that even, right? When you talk about, how do we get these principles in the first place about, that we can use to then design experiments and think about the external world and even, some things beyond that. So I think that is why there's this distinction, because it's very easy. I mean, very easy. It's relatively easy to work within a set of constraints that is empirical, which science does very well, and it's much harder and much more sort of sparse by nature, I think, and much less defined by nature when you talk about other principles in epistemology, for example. So yeah, that's how I see it, I guess.
I think, like we've said before, science is a fantastic method of investigation. It's essentially, though, a very rigorous form of induction. It doesn't really ever prove things true, but it builds up enough evidence to say, like, there's a strong reason to think this is most likely true. At least it hasn't been shown false yet. But it is confined, like we said, through empiricism. So there are limits to it. So philosophy is broader in that regard, but it would seem that science is moving faster in that regard because it is going fast in this area, whereas, philosophy is moving at sort of like that pace over a number of larger subjects. Would that sort of be the way you guys see it?
Well, I was reading this book recently about metaphilosophy, and one of the points the author was making is that both science and philosophy do something very interesting when it comes to what to begin their assumption with common sense. For example, if someone says the moon look like cheese, which is just a fact, well, it does look like cheese, right? Or the moon look very far, very close. If you try to make any philosophy or science about the moon, you cannot go against this common perception. The moon will still has to look close, regardless of how you explain where the moon is. You have to say that it does appear to be close because of something. Now we know that it appeared to be close because it's actually a very huge thing, which is still very far, but so huge that it looked close, right? That's what science says. And but even if you try another explanation, you have to be true to that common sense idea that the moon looked very close. And the same is true for anything. If you make anything in science, it has to explain common sense perception. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense to us. But philosophy is the same. If we make anything in philosophy, but whether it is about morality or epistemology, anything at all, it has to explain common sense perceptions. So science and philosophy do have this in common. They try to explain away or explain at all what we perceive in common sense. So I think that's why people feel like science and philosophy are related, even though they go to different ways at it, because we do use common sense together. We just don't use it the same way, I think.
Yeah, I mean, essentially science is born of philosophy and uses a ton of philosophical principles, and without the philosophy of science, we wouldn't have things like falsification anyway. So I think they're quite a symbiotic relationship. I think, as I've said, science is an amazing method of investigation, but there are plenty of things that it can't answer. Like it can influence things. So consider a conversation about morality. You can't really answer that with science, but you can have influence things. You can have scientific studies on the effects of abuse that can inform your whether you think that abusing someone is immoral or not. There's a couple of comments. Just like to say hello to AntiCitizen X, who has just joined the discussion and is trying to catch up. Please let us know if you disagree with anything we say. Steen says, I call echo chamber on the discussion between philosophy and science. And he says, I think there's a false presumption that because the method is constrained, that it limits the fields and topics that can be studied. There is a limitation, though, isn't there? If there isn't any way to test for it within science, if there is no empirical evidence, how can you study it, essentially? I think that's part of it. It deals with the physical. It doesn't address the metaphysical. So I think that's sort of where I'm going with the limitation there. Ricardo does have a good point. It says scientific knowledge doesn't move in a straight line or in one direction. It's more a multi-branch, and I think that's true. I think that's true of any kind of knowledge where we're actually moving forward. There is a lot of that. From any topic. I mean, it will be a case of sometimes you'll be going down a particular path thinking something is accurate, and then some bit of evidence will come up or a new line of thinking, a new argument, and you might go, oh no, that's wrong. You might leave it and you start a whole new branch, and then later on there's another new bit of evidence that actually sends you back onto that original path or a similar path to your old one. You end up over there. So I don't disagree with what you say there, and I think that applies to all sorts of knowledge that is being done in a rigorous way. Would you agree, Dave?
Yeah, sort of. I mean, science does have that one advantage where it can point to properties in the world and say this is that thing. But you can't really point to a property in the world and say this is knowledge. You have to conceive it. Yeah, it's conceptual.
Yeah.
Same as like with anything, morality and identity. These are concepts rather than actual properties that can be pointed to.
Yeah, one of the most old discussion about knowledge is, do science actually describe the world as it is, or does it only describe it as it is for us?
As it is perceived, yeah.
Yeah. If that's so, then science is more of an instrument. It describes things in a convenient way for us, but we don't really know if it describes the reality as it is. It only appears so for us, which is a very old debate. And then you get instrumentalism versus scientific realism, which the latter of is about believing that science actually describes the world as it is, like ultimately. And the former is about saying, well, not really. Maybe it isn't, and that's fine. Who cares?
So there's a comment from AntiCitizen X says, I think we need to draw a clear distinction between some things to avoid confusion. There is a major difference between philosophy as the subject matter and philosophy as in the academic institution. Dave, what do you think that is?
I'm guessing he'd have to clarify it a bit more, but I'm guessing it's about the kind of research that goes on within the academic institution and how it's being taught within academia.
I think that he's just posted another comment. People tend to confuse those things a lot in this discussion. In a way, this video is harsh on the institution, but a defense on the study itself. I mean, that's fair, but then I guess it could be taught differently in different institutions. I mean, at the beginning of this video, it's very, very different to Dave's experience of, studying philosophy. And as Kevin said, there's a few bits that, it's not completely wrong, but it's not telling the whole picture either. So there's two different experiences in the chat from two people who are studying it. So, I mean, maybe if you studied philosophy yourself, maybe you just got a really bad course and some really bad professors.
I mean, that's the thing. What's taught could depend on the institution, and the way it's taught could depend on who puts together the program and the actual institution itself. Like, what you learn at Oxford would be very different to what you learn at your local community college.
But I think we should go on with the video because the interesting points come later on. So
yeah. He does say, would you? Oh, sorry, I missed that one. I say this because the word philosophy tends to get used interchangeably to describe the two. Would you not agree? There's a major pedagogical approach to philosophy is to take an historical or survey approach. So, I mean, sorry, go for it, Dave.
I was just going to say, it's in my undergrad in the first year, we were taught various things about what historical arguments were and how they were argued and how they were put together. And that was used to learn to break down how to read philosophical texts and how to break down the ideas themselves. And then you would progress on through and see how the arguments progressed. So I suppose there is somewhat of a historical context to it and a historical survey, but there's reasons behind that. And it gets you to better thinking and better understandings. And like Kevin said, learning from mistakes is a good way to learn.
That's your knowledge with speculative. So,
and on the comment. Sorry, Philip, go ahead.
No, I just want to say that I agree that teaching mistakes is a great way to learn from them, right? Like there's undoubtedly truth to that. But then I think there has to be an explanation as to why, for example, if we take the intro of this video, right? Like why, for example, a medicine course won't go through the trouble of teaching you all these mistakes, right? Because supposedly there is utility in learning from the mistakes. So why not go through the history of that in medical school as well? Like I think there is an obvious distinction here, right? In the ways in the way these two courses approach the subject matter. And I think that the reason why these two approaches are different is because of what they're talking about essentially. But this brings me just back to the argument that I made before, so I don't want to repeat myself again. But I just want to say that although I understand and I agree that mistakes are a great way to teach certain things, I don't think that this resolves the question as to why philosophy does do this if other sort of subject fields don't do this, right? Like there is a question that needs to be answered there.
Earlier when I said that it's a moral mistake, I didn't mean that history of philosophy was a mistake. I didn't mean that Plato was wrong all the way or something.
Oh no, I don't think he was.
But that's the point. The point is, AntiCitizen does imply that older philosophy, if it's considered archaic, why do we still teach it as if it is as relevant as philosophy done today? And if it is considered as relevant, then can we really say it does progress? It's like if we said that science done 3,000 years ago is the same today, then can we really call that progress? That's the argument he's going to make. And that's why he's saying in the chat that will you not agree that the major pedagogical approach to philosophy is to take an historical survey approach? I don't mean to say that it is universal, but it is certainly prevalent in textbook and lectures. I should also point out I actually defend this approach later, which is also why I'm insisting that we watch the video, because as I say, the more nuanced arguments come later, and we look like dicks right now if we don't understand it.
That makes sense.
No, that's fair. I mean, we've only watched a couple of minutes and we've been chatting for about half an hour. So let's move on. I do have some other points there, but I'm going to try and remember them for later. So in other words, I will forget them.
You could write them down.
Philosophy.
Sorry?
You could just write them down.
I could, but I don't. Oh, I do have a pen. Oh, look at that. I will do that for future because I've already forgotten my points.
Courses do not really educate students in philosophy per se. Instead, most treatments on the subject are far better described as a history of philosophy, or perhaps a survey. Sure, it might be interesting information to some, but it is not exactly the condensed summary of modern consensus that tends to define other fields. Now, to be fair, this is not necessarily a bad thing. If a history of philosophy is really what interests you, well then by all means, go ahead and study it. There may even be real tangible value in this stuff, and so there's nothing intrinsically wrong with exploring it for its own sake. But can we please just take a moment to recognize what's really going on here? A formal education in philosophy will not actually qualify you as an authority in correct philosophical thought. At best, you will only emerge as a glorified historian and taxonomist. Much of this is intentional, too. There's an outspoken tradition in Western education that says it is always more important to teach students how to think rather than what to think. College philosophy, it seems, is just taking this doctrine to a fanatical extreme. The questions themselves are often considered more interesting than the actual answers, and the very act of thinking through arguments is widely regarded as a valuable end unto itself. Professors and textbooks alike will therefore spend plenty of effort on the comparative analysis of ideas, but rarely on the establishment of which ones are official orthodoxy. Take, for example, the classic writings of ancient Stoicism, a popular outlook on life that emphasizes self-control and mental fortitude as a path to happiness. Every undergraduate student of philosophy will eventually read about this stuff at some point, as well as the views of their contemporary rivals. If, however, you were to ask your professor whether or not Stoicism actually works, well, then you will almost certainly get a non-committal answer. To illustrate, should I adopt Stoicism for myself? Will Stoicism improve my life or make me more successful? Can Stoicism help me cope with trauma or overcome my bad habits? Are there any comparative studies evaluating this stuff empirically? Who the hell knows? Academic philosophy.
Just in that one, I mean, he's asking if there's been any scientific studies on the philosophy, which obviously can be a bit more difficult to do, especially done ethically. But then some of these things, it can be a case of, well, the person has to try it and see if it works for them. And Stoicism can really work for some people, but it doesn't necessarily work for everyone. So is that really a fair comment as well?
I do think that it can be fair, right? Like,
Yeah.
I can see the outlook on this, right? Like if this is supposed to be a way of thinking that should improve your overall well-being, then I don't see why there shouldn't be sort of scientific studies done on this to actually determine whether or not on average it does so, right? I think it's a fairly, I guess, understandable comment to or outlook to have on this. But I don't exactly think that, that everything about Stoicism boils down to this layer. So that might be why this is sort of a bit more complex than just, does it improve my life or not?
That's fair.
Yeah.
Well, I kind of disagree with AntiCitizen when he says, will it improve my life or not? Why can't a teacher just tell me, right? Because there's a few issues with that. First of all, it implies that you already have a definition of happiness, which no one has. No one ever had a stable, uniform, universal definition of happiness. Like, everyone tried to get one. It never stuck because it's impossible to pin down. That's why we still argue about it to this day. And then there is the problem of it may not be for everyone. For example, have you heard of cynicism, right? You probably heard of it. Even in cynic writing, get the point that it's not for everyone. It's for some people. And when you read philosophy, especially ethical philosophy, you may try to convince everyone, but sometimes it's pretty much implied that it isn't for everyone. Stoicism is a very good example. It's very clearly not for everyone. And it may only work like partially. You may only take some bits of it when you need it. Because there are some good lessons in Stoicism that you can apply to your own life without being a Stoic. You can take the lesson that you should be aware of what you don't have control over in your life, and you shouldn't emotionally invest yourself overtly in stuff that you don't control. If your mom and dad break up, for example, it's a classic example, it's not your fault, and you have no control over the situation. So getting too overly invested in that, emotionally invested in that, will only hurt you. So the only thing you have control over in this situation is your attitude. So you need to control that. And that's what Stoicism teaches you, to understand what you can control, which is usually your own mental attitudes, and work on that. And so to ask, will it improve your life? Yeah, it can. If you use it correctly for yourself and you actually think it might help you. Like it's like a hobby, right? It's like will playing chess make you happier? Yeah, maybe, if you actually like playing chess. It's not actually a good question, because what will make you happy is not universal. So to say will it make your life better is also not a valid question, I think, in this context, because anything could in theory make your life better or worse. So it's not a very good question, in my opinion.
That's fair. Do you guys have anything to add to that before we move on?
Maybe the question from AntiCitizen. He's asking a few questions. And chat, I mean.
So we do have from AntiCitizen is saying the main point is to emphasize that we study Stoicism because it is highly influential and not because it is scientifically validated. That's why it is canon. Oh, sorry, I think I almost killed myself. My speakers, sorry. Yes, I'm familiar with the basic teachings of Stoicism. The main point here is to raise the question, why study Stoicism in the first place rather than other things? Okay, so I mean, that's not a bad question. If you're going to be studying it and you're going to be studying it in detail, I'd say it's because it's piqued your interest and it seems like it is something that can work for you. You can learn a lot from taking... looking at a load of different worldviews. We learn a lot from history, don't we? We learn a lot from, you think about all the World War II. Think about the methodology that Hitler took to, rally everybody up and get people pumped. We can look at that sort of thing and go, oh, we can see how he's done it. We can see how he's influenced it. And we can look at other parts of the world and go, God, these sorts of methods still work. And I think if you're looking at things like Stoicism as well, I mean, you can say that actually, yeah, there's some things that we can learn from here. There's lots of different aspects of philosophy that we can learn from and we can make work for our lives, and maybe we can build on, and maybe we can build something better. Think about a scientific theory or even a hypothesis, through testing and investigation, bit by bit, we might get to a point where we can build quite a robust theory. But it could have come from quite a vague idea. So I don't see
Yeah, but I think what AntiCitizen X was asking is why does it have such an important place in the curriculum? I think not asking a general question about why would you study Stoicism or something, because I do think that maybe he would even agree that it has value to study Stoicism. I think his question was more about why does it have such an important place?
Why is that included in the actual curriculum?
Exactly. At least that's how I read the question.
Since his argument will be that philosophy doesn't have any standards, he's trying to make the point of how did we curate that this philosophy is worth teaching and not another one? How do we decide what is worth teaching?
Okay, so that's the outlook of that. Okay.
I think he's right in saying that it is.
Yeah,
how influential it is. Yeah.
He said the video will argue in a moment that Stoicism would influence historically. That's why it gets into the curriculum. Like I said, we're only making his argument right now because we keep posing. And he's going to argue that the only reason it's actually taught is mostly because of biases, cultural, historical biases. It's not actually curated. It's just because it's influential, we teach it.
Okay, so maybe
he's going to argue we don't have good standards. So that's why.
Maybe we should do the following then, because you're the only one that saw the video beforehand. Maybe you should sort of propose when to stop, since you know when these breakpoints happen, where it makes sense to talk about what was just said, and we'll do our best to sort of take notes and keep up.
If you want to follow Philip, you can go on his blog. He actually has the whole script for this video.
Oh, okay, that's great. Then
you can go onto Discord. I can send the link again, I think.
I agree with what Philip said, though. We'll carry on watching the video. And
we should keep going.
You wave your hand or say stop here, and we'll stop. We'll go on your cue, Kevin, and I'll do my best to jot down any notes that I have at the in between bits. So
I will push it in chat on YouTube. So wait a sec. Is blog post. So the same title, Stagnation of Philosophy.
Okay.
So you can follow along why we're talking about it.
Okay, sounds good.
Philosophy doesn't care about picking sides or quantifying efficacy. It only seeks to examine how other people have historically viewed the world. Success in the modern philosophical context often has very little to do with ideas being practical or insightful. Rather, success is generally measured by the degree of influence they possess. It is therefore not even a question of whether Stoicism happens to be right or wrong. We study it because it was a hugely popular force that influenced multiple centuries of development in ancient Western culture. Again, there is nothing intrinsically wrong with this sort of methodology, provided that we honestly acknowledge it for what it is. In principle, you could be the world's greatest thinker who decisively settles all the big questions for all time, and every philosophy undergraduate would still be required to slog through a gigantic mountain of inferior content before ever touching your ideas. Likewise, you could write a 4,000-page ejaculation of incoherent word salad, and all you would have to do is impress the right people in order to have your ideas taught alongside more sensible content. All of this would be perfectly tolerable, or even admirable, if not for one thing. Philosophers, in both professional and amateur circles alike, seem to be endowed with an overly optimistic sense of self-importance. University departments from across the world brag openly about how philosophy teaches students such important skills as critical thinking, logical analysis, and complex problem solving. They take pride in their supposedly dispassionate use of pure reason to create and evaluate arguments, all for the sake of developing a clear and systematic view of who we are, where we stand, and where we should be going. It all sounds wonderful in principle, but it's also a complete fiction. To demonstrate, imagine a professional community of thousands of dedicated intellectuals who are all highly trained experts in the art of truth-finding. Now imagine these same intellectuals all share a common goal of exploring difficult questions, collecting evidence, evaluating arguments, and deriving the most sensible conclusions possible. Naturally, we should expect such a group to eventually reach a unanimous consensus.
Sorry, Philip, did you want to stop there?
No, I didn't want to say that. No, I didn't. I have a lot to say, but I didn't want to stop the video. So
Stop soon, but not right now.
Sorry, I saw you. I thought I saw you wave, so my bad.
On every question posed, given that they all share the same methods, the same goals, the same evidence, and the same arguments. If anything, the very existence of any disagreement whatsoever would only prove that certain members of that community are either not following the correct guidelines, not sharing the same evidence, or not being sincere in their supposed quest for truth. The more disagreement there is, in fact, the more evident it would be that such a group is neglecting to enforce consistent standards of honest inquiry. Now imagine that very same group utterly failing to converge on a single point of agreeable fact, and you would finally have something that closely resembles modern philosophy. In a famous study by Bourget and Chalmers, hundreds of PhD-level philosophers from around the world were surveyed on a variety of foundational topics. You would think that if philosophers really are the great experts in reason that they claim to be, then we should expect an overwhelming consensus on the major questions of their field. The results, however, were the exact opposite. Not a single question could garner any consensus above 90%, and only one question was able to break above 80%. We're not even talking about weird esoteric issues either, but fundamentally basic questions to all of philosophy itself. For example, what is truth? What is knowledge? What is logic? Do we have free will? Is there such a thing as good and evil? It cannot be overstated that in most any other professional field of study, this would be an absolute embarrassment. Yet, when it comes to academic philosophy, this is apparently just par for the course. For the last 100 years, the philosophical community has been researching, questioning, arguing, debating, evaluating, and educating, but they still cannot even fully commit to the existence of an objective reality beyond our sense perception. Even more embarrassing for the philosophical community is how...
I think it's a good point to stop for now. So, because it's just the end of this point, basically.
Yep.
So, if we try to synthesize this point, it's that if one of the criteria for expertise is having consensus among experts, then the fact that philosophers don't have much consensus is a problem. Because if we don't have much consensus, can we really call ourselves expert in anything? That's the argument he's making right now, right? And well, this is a study by Chalmers, which I know about. I think that you either saw this study before or heard of Chalmers before, right? Okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
So this study is very famous and very disliked by the world of philosophy, not because it exposed us or anything, but because it's a simplistic way to look at it. Because take a look at the questions, right? Is the external world real? And then the options are realism, skepticism, idealism, author, right? That's the one we are seeing on screen right now. The problem with this is there are an infinite variation of position you can take when you're a realist, a skeptic, an idealist, or something else. So even if you say you're a realist, there's more than one type of realist. I mentioned scientific realism earlier, right? That's one type of realist. That's not the only one. There are material realists. There are physical realism, physicalism, I think it's called. There's a lot of things like that. So what's the problem with this question? It's implied that we can answer those questions easily. Like, imagine if we ask physicists, does the atom exist? And we don't give them a definition of atom. We don't give them what type of what do we imply by that? We just say that. Do atom exist? Like, if the person you asked the question and understood the word atom as, oh, you meant atom like the old Greeks were meaning? No, it doesn't exist that way. But you meant like Newton? Well, sort of right. You get my point, right? If you don't give a precise definition of what you're asking to scientists and philosophers, you will get weird survey answers like that. That's a big problem to methodology that was pointed out by pretty much everyone, because philosophers are very nuanced. So asking very broad yes or no question like that is bound to give you vague answers like that too.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of philosophy is very complex and in depth.
And didn't agree with me. It could have been more nuanced because that's a methodological problem.
Yeah. I mean, you consider trying to have a conversation on Twitter and someone wants to talk to me about morality, explain morality. Why do you think that there's some truth to realism or objective morality? And you're like, well, this is a really complex and nuanced topic. I'd like to, if you want to have this conversation, let's talk about it. If not, there's this article and this video and there's all this information that you can take in and look at it. And then they try and force this conversation to be had on a platform where you're limited to 280 character messages. And then they go, yeah, well, I don't accept your arguments. So yeah, okay.
So that's one problem I have with it. The second one I have is, philosophers don't always have strong position, which is normal because we deal with very complex ideas that are not always like. Every philosopher I know would tell you that one of the big problems with committing to a worldview like realism, skepticism, or idealism is that you have to commit, which means you commit to every problem there is with it too. So to take a less strong position is safer, which is why a lot of philosophers actually are weak realists or weak idealists, weak skeptics, not strong one. So to say that 81% of philosophers are realists might be accurate, but how many of those are strong realists? Not a lot, I'm willing to bet. Most are probably weak realists. That is, they're not that committed to it. Usually philosophers will recognize the validity or the relevancy of an argument, but he won't always commit to them. Like, I can recognize that Berkeley, the idealist, make very good and interesting arguments, but I'm not an idealist like Berkeley. I just agree that he makes good arguments. It still did not convince me, even if I recognize it's good. And that's the problem. If you ask philosophers, is this good? He may say yes, but I don't believe it. The same way you can ask someone, do you think God would be good if he exists? Yeah, I just still don't believe God exists, right? That's the same. You don't have to believe in something to recognize something about it, right?
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. So, did you want to say something, Joe?
I was just going to ask the question about. I wrote something down, and you know what my memory's like. So there's a bit in there that said disagreements equals worse standards.
That's something that I wanted to go.
Yeah, I mean, why would you say the standards are worse if more people disagree over something? I mean, surely the fluid exchange of ideas and the disagreement till you actually do get to a point where there is eventually a consensus is a good thing. And if something isn't settled, then the disagreements actually show that people are being skeptical. They're holding themselves to a good standard. I mean, maybe some people are coming in from various ideologies. We're all prone to biases, but part of skeptical thought is actually to show that we're thinking about things and we're trying to, almost disprove ourselves at the same time. So I don't think that a disagreement is necessarily a bad standard. I think it's a bit different when there is something where there is clearly a hell of a lot of evidence for. I mean, like the shape of the Earth, and evolution and vaccines and things like that. the fact that people are disagreeing there when something is essentially as settled as it can be for good science, that's a problem.
With because every settled science can be unsettled at some point.
Of course it can.
Let's not be presumptuous about that, right?
No, I agree. But I will say that a lot of these things are at the best place that they can be for right now, and there's nothing wrong with continuing to look into them, or trying to improve them, trying to find a better option than, say, vaccines. But I will say there are some things that are very settled. And you brought up earlier as well, Kevin, there are, within philosophy, topics that are settled and there is a general consensus. But there are a lot of topics where they're still so open, they're so broad, they're still talked about because we don't know, because we don't have answers. And that disagreement there, I think, is healthy. It's good. It's, we're not settling on, well, that one sounds good. I think it would be a worse standard to sit back and go, well, yeah, that one will do.
Okay, so pretty much, I think you echoed a lot of what I wanted to say on this, in the sense that I don't think that it translates immediately, like from the observation that there is no consensus or something like that it automatically means that the standards are bad for the evaluation, right? Because I do think, for example, I do think that if you compare this to science, right, if you did have certain observations of the world and then you had this sort of breakup of consensus in terms of certain questions that are supposed to be settled by science, then you could argue, I think, quite effectively that the standards, whatever standards we're using, they're not good enough, right? There's something broken in them. But I do think that there is, again, as I argued already, I think it also matters what you're talking about, right? Because it might be that what you're talking about and what you're discussing in general is such that even if you are extremely good and extremely well trained in sort of rationality, let's say, or logic, or all these things, then even with this extreme training, even if everyone agrees pretty much on these things, and by the way, this is something that a lot of philosophers agree on, right? I would like to see how many philosophers would be able to publish in a philosophy journal something that is plainly invalid in classical logic. I'd like to see how that would go, right? But that's my point, right? There are standards on the reasonings and the way we reason and logic, and someone might say, well, they are dialetheists, right? They think that there can be contradictions. Yes, but even they will acknowledge that a true contradiction is a massive burden on whatever you're trying to argue, right? And that comes out of sort of purely theoretical observations about logic, right? That's what motivates dialetheism and paraconsistent logics and all of that. So, what I'm trying to say is that the subject matter matters, right? You can't just say, oh well, there is no consensus, therefore there are bad standards, right? There's more to this discussion, and I think this is what you were saying, Joe. And actually, I don't know if I just to finish off, my point is maybe this is maybe just an idea that I just came up with, and maybe it's a bad way to think about it. It's just a random thought, but maybe the progress of philosophy, because I do think in some sense this is accurate, right? The progress of philosophy is measured in terms of how much it moves forward, but it should be measured, I think, sort of horizontally, how wide the conversation is getting, right? Because there is a lot of you could think of progress in philosophy about how much additional things we're building on top of and strengthening the arguments on each side, even, right? How much reflection are we putting on arguments that were for this side and the opposing side, right? And how these build up over time, and how we discovered, right, that maybe one of these is flawed, and how we repaired it, right? Even though we're still remaining at sort of a 50-50%, which is not the case, by the way, on most issues. But even if we were to stay at a 50-50% sort of divide on a particular issue, you could still argue that, the complexity of the arguments on each side is evolving, and that is a way that you could measure progress, right? How sophisticated these arguments are getting, and how well and more and complicated they are getting, and how much they extend further into regions that we didn't even consider maybe at the beginning of this whole journey, let's say. And at the beginning it was very simplistic, and now it's super complicated and very articulated, right? Like, I think that is progress as well in how solid these things are, right? So yeah, these are just my 2 cents, I guess.
I think you have a good argument there when you say that there are more than one way to measure progress, or what we consider progress. You mentioned horizontal progress, but I think another way to view it is, think about it the way training work, right? If you are an athlete, or not necessarily an athlete, for example, you train to solve puzzles fast. Well, over time, you solve the same puzzle faster and faster. It's the same puzzle, but you solve it faster and faster, like a Rubik's Cube, for example. Well, philosophy works a bit the same. We get exposed to the same ideas again and again, but we get to the same hurdle into conversation faster. Like the very old problems, like the problem of identity, for example. We get the same argument over and over, but because other people did it before us, we study what he did, so we go faster and faster and go into that blocking point, so we can go a little bit further, and then we repeat the cycle. It's like when you play Dark Souls, right? You go to the boss, you get killed, you start again, but you go a little faster this time until you eventually kill the boss. And then it's the next level, and you do the same thing again and again. Philosophy is a bit like that. You keep hurting yourself on the wall, and you go faster and faster over time. And yes, sometimes we have a setback because we expose a new problem that was there all along that we didn't notice, like a secret boss. We're talking about the video games. That's one way to view it. But I think we're also reaching the point which will please you, because it's about ethics, which is the fact that what is morally right to let people speak about? Like, is it morally right to let people speak falsehoods that we consider mostly false? And this problem, which may sound very novel, isn't novel at all. It had been discussed for aeons. Like recently, I was reading again On Liberty by John Stuart Mill, and chapter 2 speak about this, about the idea that we believe that epistemologically speaking, we can only have knowledge if we have freedom of speech and thought. That you have to let people speak nonsense. You have to do it, and you have to teach a little bit about falsehoods too, to some degree. Of course, it's not absolute. Obviously, it doesn't believe in absolute. But I agree with this point that if you don't teach falsehoods, if you don't let idiots speak too, like if you don't let the Platonists speak about the flat Earth, well, you're doing yourself a disservice. My teacher my teacher I'm having for my internship made a good point the other day. He said, if you said you don't like racist, but do you know a racist argument? Do you know what are their positions? Most people don't know the answer to those questions. Like if you ask someone, oh, you think racism is bad, why? It's blank. And that's bad. We're not supposed to blank when someone asks us that, but we do. And the same can be said about mostly moral question, but it's also valid for other stuff. If you say, oh, I believe the Earth is not flat, and you're not able to disprove it, or you don't even know what the argument of flat earthers is, how are you going to rebuke them, right? You have to listen to them to rebuke them at the very least. So one could say that philosophy is that here we listen to every dumb idea ever just to refute it at the very least. Like when we read Nazi philosophers, which does exist, we often do so without to refute them or to point out that, yes, this point is good, but the context of why you're saying this is ridiculous, right? So I think there's... he said, and the chat, and Citizen said, the Aquinas devote under the page to angelology, the study of angels, right? But there is it's not completely worthless. Like, you have to remember the context. People actually believe in God. They actually believe in angels. And one of the things that he had to explain was, if angels can have any form, what does that mean? Because angels are described in the Bible in so many ways. They can be flaming wheels or humanoids or animals or whatever, right? But Aquinas tried to explain it in a rational way. And this work, even if it's about what most atheists would consider fiction, is still very interesting because it's a rationalization process. That is in itself very interesting to study, the act of rationalization. Even if it's something that we don't believe in. Like, have you seen people trying to justify slavery or racism? It's very interesting. And you have to understand that to understand how to play against it now, right?
Well, I mean, on that point, it's something we often say about, I think all of us here are atheists, aren't we? I know, and you
Yeah,
are, aren't you,
I
as
think
well?
we are all atheists.
So, I mean, one thing that we will say to other atheists who, especially on the internet, who tend to go for the more colloquial definition of atheism, that generally their argument is, I only lack belief, you're not showing me evidence. I don't have to justify my position. But what you say there is right. Quite often there is a lack of understanding about various theistic arguments. And every theist that you speak to will have a different set of arguments. Some of them are more powerful than others, and some of them are complete nonsense. Obviously, none of them have convinced us to believe, but some of them we will say that actually, yeah, that one gave me pause for thought, and I think about it. And these are the reasons I don't accept that argument, because you're not going to convince a theist or any theist not to be theists anymore just by going, don't believe you. No. So I agree with what you say.
If it did.
But yeah, wouldn't it? But I mean, I agree with what you say there. You have to listen to some of these ideas and go, okay, and poke holes in it, ask questions about it.
Do I like that Aristotle defends slavery? Of course not. I don't like that. But I find it interesting because I can put it in context with the rest of his philosophy and speculate a bit about what made him think that. Was it just prejudice? Was it the context? And part of me think that it is a bit incongruous with what he says, because when you consider who Aristotle was, he was a metek, which is someone that isn't part of the city, but he's not a slave either. He's like a stranger. He's like one step above a slave, basically. He's a free man, but not by much. He's not allowed to vote or anything like that. And he was employed in the city as a teacher for teaching law. So he was teaching lawyers and politicians. So considering who he was, doesn't it make sense that a man like that not challenge the views of the morals of his time, that he wouldn't challenge the idea that slavery is okay and racism is okay when he's actually teaching people that actually have the power to kill him or exile him? Makes sense. So, and he's not the only one. Of course, it's very possible I actually did believe those stuff, but you can see when you read it that it doesn't make sense with what he said previously, which shows that he's only human, right? People are nonsensical. They contradict themselves all the time. So philosophers are no exception to that. You can have a philosopher that defend, like Kant, for example. I defend a very universal and very open and tolerant philosophy, but you can be the biggest dick ever in private life. Like, Kant is an asshole. He's a misandrist. He hates everyone. He's pretty much a terrible person. But he argued for a very tolerant philosophy, which is kind of weird, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that's how people are. Like, if you read any philosopher and you look at their personal life, oftentimes they are kind of terrible. Like Marx, for example. Marx argued for a lot of very good ideas, like very morally progressive ideas, but he was a drunkard and started bar fight. He was a terrible person. He treated his own servant. He had servants. Did you know that? Marx had servants, and he was against that, which is even more ridiculous.
I think Kevin brought up a great point. I think like part of what philosophy deals with in a like simplistic sense, I would say, is about thought, right? It's about thinking. So of course you like that makes sense, right? It makes sense that it would, as a subject matter, it would look at all the bad arguments and why they're bad and spend like maybe even what appears needless amount of time on these arguments, right? So, because it is a fascination about how thinking works. So of course that is going to be a focus, both on the good and the bad side.
AntiCitizen wants us to address that he's trying to talk about the fact that we study apparently because we study Aristotle and people like him because of his influence for their own sake. To read him, it sounds like you're arguing something with a certain point in this video. It's not a question of Aristotle being right or wrong, but exploring his influence and arguments for their own sake, which is what he's objecting about, because he says that shows a lack of standards. If you only study someone because of its influence and not because of its relevancy, then that's wrong. That's like if we study the scientists that were talking about ether and other weird thermodynamics theories before the modern ones, right? If we only taught them because of their influence, the art is bad, because that's not relevant to nowadays, right?
Yeah, fair.
So we want us to address that, if you have anything to say about that.
Dave, you've been quiet. Do you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, sorry, my dog's having a bit of a pester me kind of moment. I think, yeah, we do kind of study philosophers for the influence that they have. But I'm not sure that's necessarily a bad thing because, like Philip says, it's studying thought. It's studying how people think. And I think it's Hegel who said philosophy can't really be removed from its time, and the time influences. Sorry?
Or mystery itself, yeah.
Yeah, that's it.
And I agree with your point there. I agree. Because if you think about it, isn't it only natural that we study influential thinker? Because he's right. We could learn, like many people made the same arguments over time. So why do we read about this one over this one? That's a good question. But the way to answer it is very simple. People in the past also studied the influential thinkers. So ironically enough, if you want to study Aquinas, for example, you have to know Aristotle, because Aquinas is very much influenced by Aristotle. So since everyone is like an affiliation like that, it makes sense that it traces line of philosophers that you have to study, because it's how it works in history. And why don't we teach about Malebranche, for example? Do you know about Nicolas Malebranche? It's a philosopher from the modern era, the same era as Spinoza and Descartes. You didn't know about him, right?
Not at all.
But yeah, he has very, very similar ideas to Spinoza and Descartes. He make almost identical arguments, more or less. But he's different anyway, but he make very similar arguments. So why don't we study him more? And why do we only teach it if the teacher feel like it? Well, that's because the canon of philosophy explored the most influential thinkers, because that's the thinkers that will be referenced the most. That's the same way in science when you say, what are the most influential theories in science? Well, Newtonian physics is a good example, right? You will reference Newtonian physics a lot in physics. But that's not to say that there wasn't other physical theories, right? Theories in physics. They just were not as influential. So that's why we don't refer to them as much when we compare historical views of science. It's chemistry. I was talking about ether before, right? Well, we know about it, and we know about other thermodynamic theories because it was more influential. And that's the same. So, as he said, to say, sorry, he's saying something in the chat, I think.
Yeah, I wanted to comment on that too at some point.
There's quite a few comments in the chat that I do want to address, but which one specifically did you want to address there?
Okay, he's saying that he doesn't like that university said that philosophy teaches you certain problem-solving skills. Like, you cannot have the cake and eat it too. If philosophy is about exploration, then you don't get to market the profession as a place that teaches specific truths and the skill. If you accept a university's pages and miscellaneous professionals are overselling the profession, then we are in agreement. Does that make sense? First of all, university oversell everything, first of all. It oversell everything to begin with. But even then, I don't agree, because it does teach you those truth-finding skills. It does teach you logical coherence, analytical skills, and stuff like that. Does everyone internalize those skills? Obviously not, but that's the same for anyone in university. You don't necessarily master those skills even if you do graduate, which is unfortunate, but that's how university works, right?
Yeah, I mean, with regard to... Oops, sorry, Philip, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, I didn't want to.
I was just going to say, part of that is the fault of education in the capitalist system. They're all trying to get your money, so they're all trying to market something as best as possible and as catchy as possible, and to make you want to go to that particular school and take that particular course. So they might sort of not tell the whole truth.
Yeah, the same with scientific profession. Like, if you only take a bachelor level chemistry or physics class, you're not ready to go to the highest level of research. Yet the university will try to sell you like you're going to find a job only with a bachelor, which is false. We all know it. You don't get a job with only a bachelor into science nowadays, most of the time anyway. But the university has to sell you the bachelor, so they will try to tell you that it's a safe way to get a job, even though you have to go further than that. Philosophy is the same. Try to tell you that bachelor is enough to get something, which is false. You have to get at least a master level to get something.
Yeah, I don't understand why it would be like you cannot have the cake and eat it too. I don't understand it, right? Like, why would there be a tension between sort of exploring different ideas and then, sort of say that it is about sort of truth finding skills and stuff like that. I do think that logic, at least like this is what I found for myself, I do think that logic, and more broadly speaking, sort of epistemology and studying that sort of stuff, is one of the best ways that you can develop your critical thinking skills. Right? I don't think there's any study that you can get into that will develop these more than philosophy in this sense. Right? Like I couldn't think of any. Like if you care about, what makes you tick and how good arguments work and why they work and why they don't work, you study philosophy. And part of that is studying arguments that don't work and explaining why they don't work, right? And again, standards about logic and sort of like broadly speaking, the rationality, maybe even informal fallacies, if you want to go into informal logic, they have huge consensus even among philosophers, right? Like, again, try to publish a paper with an invalid argument. I want to see how far you'll go.
Not very far.
Not very far, no.
Yeah.
Not very far.
No, and I think that's
Like,
one thing that you actually
does. I'm sorry, continue.
I was just going to say, Philip, it's the point you made earlier as well. I mean, there may be disagreements between people about different things, but generally there's still a standard there of the logic, the validity, the justification, and everything that it goes through. So I don't think the disagreement shows the bad standard. It's how people disagree will show whether it's a bad standard or not.
And I wanted to say, like I told you earlier, I'm doing an internship to teach, right?
Yep.
So I actually did some grading this week for my internship. And I got to see firsthand how it is to grade. And I got to say, first of all, of course, like most fields that are about writing, you have to judge qualitatively because it's not only truth or fair. It's about how good an argument is or how well you compare two things or stuff like that. And it's very telling when someone has a good argument and a bad one. Like it's very easy to judge. And there are actually objectively quantifiable ways to do so. Like, for example, one of the questions he gave to a student, my internship supervisor, was compare Alcibiade and Gorgias and their respective work, which, if you don't know the story, both are about ignorant people, but in different ways. Alcibiade is a naive, ignorant person. He's doubly ignorant, and he thinks he's better than everyone because of his born privilege. He's a rich kid, basically. And then he's better than everyone that way because he thinks he should be in power. Gorgias is different because this guy is a rhetor, is a narrator. He loves to speak and he's good at it. He's good at manipulating and persuading people. So he's ignorant in a different way because he's not a scientist. He's not an expert in anything. But he's good at persuading idiots that he's good at something. So they are different. And the point of the exercise was to compare the two. And the students that did poorly were very obvious because they were comparing like, oh, they are both similar because they are both talking to Socrates. Yeah, good job, student. That's not a very good example. That's not what you wanted to talk about. Oh, they are both different because they are not. One is an expert in something. No, they are neither of them are expert in anything. Did you read the book? Like it's very obvious who is good at something because, like when you're actually an expert, you actually get to recognize the novice mistakes that I use to make myself, that everyone does at the novice level. And like he's saying in the chat, you are making claims about what philosophy claims to teach, but the sheer inability of professionals to agree on basic question of the field seem to empirically falsify this premise. Do you think it is possible for two educated professionals to make two sound, good faith arguments but arrive at incompatible conclusions? Yes, I actually do.
Yeah, I do think that like maybe the point here is if you want to be picky, maybe I'm picky because I take sound to mean in a logical sense, right? Like they can be both sound, right? Like it's impossible for them to be both sound arguments if you take sound to mean in sort of deductive logic to mean a valid with correct premises, right? Because if they come to incompatible conclusions, then that wouldn't be possible, right? But
they'd both be valid in what you're saying there. They'd both be logically valid. They could be both valid,
and they could be both reasonable, especially if the topic that they are discussing is such that it's very hard to figure out, right? Like it's perfectly fine. Like it's perfectly possible for these things to happen, but if you want to test actually, how sort of philosophical thinking is applied in the world for example, even of science, right? Like you can take most experiments, you can map most experiments in science to be pretty much sort of modus tollens and modus ponens, right? Like they map perfectly to that, right? You have a hypothesis, and then you have an observation, and if that observation doesn't come through, then it has to be like one of the premises has to be false and stuff like that, right? It's very easy to map that.
I don't know if AntiCitizen was there earlier when I mentioned that philosophers and scientists do differ, and that epistemologically speaking, philosophers have diverse views of epistemology, while scientists usually agree on epistemological frameworks.
Exactly. Yeah.
To start from the same point of, to start from the same line, to start at the same point.
Exactly.
We don't always do, and that's a big difference. For example, if you already believe in yes, true or false, if you believe in like binary truths, which is not the case of most science nowadays, but that's just an example, right? Then obviously someone arguing from the perspective that there is more than true or false will disagree with you, obviously. But those very basic assumptions, like epistemological assumptions, like fundamental level, are impossible to argue without doing a petition principle. It's impossible, and scientists are in the same boat as philosophers in that one. The difference is, as I said, scientists will just what's the expression? I forgot. we just go over it. We just leave that behind them. We just accept this incongruity and say, oh, well, we still take this framework as decent enough for us, and we run with it. We don't argue much about the framework. That's philosophers of science.
Exactly. That's philosophers of science. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, also something he's just said, that the problem is that they may not be able to tell who's right. And I don't think that's necessarily true either. Think about if you had a hypothesis. So we're doing science again, right? And you've got a number of different hypotheses. But let's just say that actually you can't test for all of them because you don't necessarily have all the equipment or anything like that. And you've got a couple of hypotheses that you've shown to be wrong, and you're left with a couple that, had you got the right materials, you could test for, but you don't have the right materials. So you know that it's either hypothesis 3 or hypothesis 5 that you've got. That's what it seems to be left over from all the things that you've tested. You don't know which one's right, but one of them will be right. And if there's two really good arguments that are against each other, maybe you don't have enough information to actually say, no, this is the sound one. They're both valid. They're both well structured. They're both well justified. They're good arguments. They've ended up in different places because they've got slightly different inferences. They've got slightly different experiences. And there isn't enough information to actually say which one is correct. Now, with science, it is easier to go and find which is the most likely conclusion through all the testing and everything like that. Obviously, my hypothetical was to just try and draw a line there, saying that you could end up in a place where you don't know what's definitely right, or at least most likely. But I don't think people arriving to different conclusions is a bad thing. It's a case of they need to keep working on the problem and constantly reconsidering their own position and other people's positions and looking for how it fits in. So I disagree that is actually a problem, unless people just stop there. That's when it's a problem. If people go, well, I think this, so fuck you. That's a problem. Because they're not actually engaging their critical thought at this point. They've managed to produce what you said was a sound argument. We go for a valid and well-justified argument, and then they've gone, well, I'm not looking into this any further. I'm just sticking with this opinion. That's the problem. And I don't think that that's how it really works in philosophy. It might to some people. I'm sure there's certain individuals who go, yeah, well, I'm great, so I'm sticking with my thoughts on this. But I think in general, when there's a disagreement in philosophy, it shows that there's still more work to be done. And people carry on looking into it. They keep trying to justify their ideas, look for new arguments, and try and supplement the thinking with more thinking. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Dave.
No, that sounds right. And I think one of the other things as well is this goes back to the whole conceptual idea. I mean, what we're discussing here, the real world plays a part. and there may be empirical evidence to help support either way. But when you're talking about something conceptual, other people might conceive other things about it, and we might not have the whole concept built up yet, which means more discussion is needed. Someone might point out an error in the concept or a contradiction, and that means more discussion is needed and more viewpoints are needed. And I think that's one of the problems. There's no way to say morality is this in the same way as to say DNA is this.
Yeah, I agree. Going back a little bit, because there's actually quite a few comments, and I do apologize to everybody for letting the chat lie, but Danny had a point earlier, which I agree with. It says there's a difference between consensus and there being established facts in the field, and I think that's good as well, because I mean, the consensus is obviously the opposite to the disagreements. Just because you've got a consensus on something doesn't mean that the answer is right. It depends on how they come about the consensus. Now, if there's established facts, you'd expect there to be a consensus among the professionals in the fields along those lines. But the other way round, if there's no established facts, the consensus doesn't necessarily say there's a good standard, just in the same way that a disagreement doesn't necessarily mean that there's a bad standard. I hope that's what you were going for with that comment, Danny. I've inferred my own bias over that. So if I'm wrong with that, please correct me. Oh yeah, so someone said something similar to that. Yeah, consensus generally consists in established facts concerning some field, and that's right, generally it does, or there are some things where it's not even necessarily established facts. It's all the evidence seems to be pointing this way. Look at ancient history. There's a lot of things within ancient history there. You sort of they all look at the historical evidence, all the historians this is, and they all come up with their own sort of ideas, and then they strip away the bulk of the disagreements and they go, what's left, and here's the consensus. So these are the bits that we're fairly certain happened from what we can elicit, and everything else it's a bit fuzzy. Alistair says, hey Alistair, sorry, I didn't even see you come in there. You've been here for quite a while. He says, philosophy's progress can be hard to quantify. Maybe it deals with eliminating views from logical space. For example, there is no serious philosophy of numerology or philosophy of demons anymore. So good philosophy deletes itself.
I mean, we can bring it back if you want.
Sorry?
We can bring it back. We can bring that back if we want.
Yes, we could. I don't think anybody wants that. So just carrying on. Ricardo says, are we trying to bait you? I don't think we're trying to bait you, dude. I don't know what that was in reference to. That was quite a while ago. Sorry. Hey, J Mike, nice to have you here. So he's asking the question, is this sourced from the Phil Papers survey? I think that was what it was from, wasn't it? No? What was it? It was the Chalmers, David Chalmers paper. Yes, sorry. Yeah. There you go. There's my memory again. Danny says, I think even many atheists think that some of the arguments for the existence of God are really interesting. I mean, we said so ourselves earlier on this stream. And I think they can be. I don't necessarily find them convincing, but they've given me pause for thought before. And I think, listening to these arguments and having a good answer for them is a lot better than going, well, yeah, that's just not evidence, or I don't accept it, or some of the terrible responses we see on Twitter. And in fact, if people spent more time thinking about it in a philosophical way, then perhaps. He also says, you can learn a lot from arguments that you don't take to be sound. Yeah, you definitely can. You definitely can. I mean, even if they're not valid, you can learn, the structure of an argument. And going through the process, you can learn, oh, well, this isn't valid. Why is it not valid? Well, it's not valid because this doesn't follow on from that, and so on and so forth. And and okay, this is a logically valid argument, but I still don't find it sound. Well, why don't you find it sound? Well, you see, it's committing basically a little bit of an ad populum in this part, or it's an argument from induction that's too vague. And actually, there are some examples where we can show that this premise not to be true. So the way it's worded, it's not necessarily wholly correct, and so on and so forth. I definitely agree with you there. You've got to learn from bad stuff. Sorry, go on, Philip.
No, I don't know where you. Sorry, go ahead. Maybe if you continue to read through the things, then we're going to get to a point that I want to discuss.
Okay. So AntiCitizen says, this is the rub though. Is philosophy about the arguments, or does philosophy teach you the skills to resolve them correctly?
So I want to say, I don't know how you can come away from a logic class and not think that philosophy teaches you how to resolve them correctly, right? Because to some extent it's mathematical, right? It can, if you ask philosophers what is a valid argument, or you give them a form and ask them if this is a valid argument, the consensus of that is going to be so strong. It's going to be probably stronger than any scientific thing ever, because it's so mathematical. It's almost like saying 1 + 2 is 3, right? Because of how validity is defined in logic, at least in classical logic, right? So if you're constrained to classical logic, then I'm pretty sure there's going to be 100% consensus or around that, right? So I don't know how you can come away thinking that it doesn't teach you at least that. Then, of course, you can say, well, that's not all that there is to logic, to arguments, right? We know that that's only half the picture, or only some small portion of the picture. I don't know how much you want to attribute to validity, but even then, right? Philosophy is the one building the frameworks that we then can sort of agree on and utilize to then sort of determine whether or not, for example, premises are correct. Or what do we do next? What do we do if we have premises and we're not able to determine, which ones are more likely? What do we do? Then we have certain other suggestions, for example, like OPI, and suggests sort of comparative sort of worldview comparisons, right? And talks about simplicity and theoretical virtues, right? All of these things are sort of coined in sort of philosophy, and the problem is that we are sort of building the frameworks to figure out which arguments are better at the same time as we are evaluating the arguments themselves, right? But what does that mean? Does it mean that we just stop, trying to figure out which frameworks work best to evaluate which arguments are better? I don't think so, right? That conversation is important. I think as much as probably one of the most important conversations that you can have, right? How do we evaluate which arguments are good past, for example, logical validity? This is a very interesting philosophical question, right? But sort of that's my point, though, right? All of these things about validity, which, by the way, do resolve a lot of arguments, because a lot of arguments genuinely sort of, if they don't come from philosophers, do tend to be sort of sometimes valid, sometimes not. And this already helps you to evaluate. And this is already a skill that can be assigned to critical thinking if we want to connect back to the previous point, right? So there's a lot there, right? And then sort of informal logic has their own standards as well. And you can learn about
there is some development in the chat. I was talking with AntiCitizen, and he acknowledged my argument about saying that one big difference is that sciences are mostly a consensus on epistemology, so basic principles of knowledge, which simplify further consensus. And philosophy doesn't have those consensus. We don't have basic consensus on morality, epistemology, metaphysics, which makes it much harder to have consensus. You have consensus with people that already agree with some of those basic principles. That's it, right? And he said that he agreed with me on that it's true that philosophy doesn't seem to have an official epistemology, but that this is bad. And I said, well, that's weird. Are you suggesting that it's bad to question and debate epistemology, that we should approach science and philosophy in a dogmatic way, that we should just stick with one and go with it? And he said, well, just because you have an official standard doesn't mean dogma. Like science as a methodology, we look at it all the time. Yes, but that's not what you're saying. You're still saying that you have to assume it to some degree, which is a more dogmatic approach, which is fine in itself, by the way. We do have to assume the principle of we take for granted in science are true for us to do science to what we do. So we do have to do that to some degree. But why should philosophy do that? We don't have to. We don't actually necessarily have the same goals as science do. And that's not necessarily a problem either, right? Like, do science concern itself with morals very often? Not that often. Does science concern itself with
bioethics and stuff like that? But then the second science is addressing. Right? Yeah, of course.
Does science concern itself with politics? Well, not really, because if you look at political science, which is the formal study of politics, do they ever study the theoretical? Yes, they do, but more in a systematic way. They want to understand the inner works of politics. They don't actually debate what is the best system. They don't do that. That's what we do. And that's why I said that when I see people that are educated in political science debate, they actually do a pretty bad job at it, because they understand politics, they understand how government work, but they are terrible at justifying why it should be that way, which is the job of political philosophers, to justify why we should do X or Y. So because most of the world of philosophy is about justification, which is my argument, that philosophy is mostly about justification, and is not just descriptive, because philosophy is prescriptive, it's normative, which is something that most philosophers will agree with, that philosophy is prescriptive and normative. It is descriptive by necessity, because you need some description to be normative and prescriptive, but it's secondary to that goal, in my opinion. Like, even metaphysics are done usually with something in mind. How should we want to understand how the world really is, because we want to know how to better study it. So even in that context, metaphysics are done to better orient our studies, and epistemology is done the same way. The only reason we care about epistemology is to better understand the world. There's always a goal. There's always a prescription behind that, right?
Hi.
I'm not losing you, Hiro.
No, that was great.
I know my English isn't perfect sometimes.
Oh no, it's perfect.
Yeah, mine neither. So.
Mine isn't, and I'm English.
In fact, most English people's English isn't particularly great, to be fair. It's only marginally better than Americans.
I was going to bring up something similar to what Kevin brought up, in that, like, in political philosophy, we talk about ways to run politics, ways to run countries, how, laws should work and things like that. But there's nothing really that you can say, well, this is how a government should work. You can only argue the best ways. There's no way to point to and say this is the ideal government without all of the theoretical arguments and the conceptual arguments and things like that. Because, what is the best government? What is the best way to run a government? There's no singular property that you can point to say this is that thing.
Philosopher King.
Yeah, Plato. Let's just have a bunch of warriors and a bunch of scholars. Sort of Confucianism.
Would you say this is a good point to continue the video?
I just wanted to address a couple more comments because people are conversing.
I do think that we'll have to move on at some point, though, because we're not going to make it otherwise.
Okay. I'll tell you what. If anybody wants me to read out any of their comments, just repeat it, and I'll get to it in the next section, or at the end, and send it straight to me. Because to be fair, we're taking a half-hour chat between each section, so you're very, very right there. We do need to move on.
Reality beyond our sense perception. Even more embarrassing for the philosophical community is how many of the traditionally deep philosophical questions have already been long solved by professionals in other fields. Take, for example, the nature of morality and ethical behavior. Biologists and economists collectively solved this problem decades ago in that they both arrived at the same basic description via independent lines of investigation. Self-interest, when coupled with social interdependence and scarcity, naturally gives rise to cooperative pro-social behaviors. This is not a matter of any serious debate either, but a well-established field, complete with its own mathematical formalism, laboratory experiments, and real-world applications. Yet, to this very day, we still find philosophers who obsess endlessly about whether or not pulling the lever is murder. This is exactly why academic philosophy has a less than stellar reputation among professional scientists, engineers, and the public at large. One of the most famous examples of this frustration was even voiced by Professor Stephen Hawking himself when he publicly declared that philosophy is dead. Mind you, he wasn't saying that philosophy is a completely pointless thing to study. Rather, he was complaining about the inability of philosophers to make progress and keep up with the times. Cosmologists are out there making amazing discoveries every day about the fundamental nature of space, time, and even causality itself. Yet philosophers are still debating such banal questions as, what is the nature of being? They're not solving any new problems, they're just rehashing the same meaningless rhetoric for decade after decade. Countless philosophers have shrieked at the idea that their beloved profession might be dead, but the sheer childishness of their rebuttals only proves the point further. They'll say such vapid things as, well, science is philosophical, or that Hawking himself holds to questionable philosophical views, or that the claim itself is just ill-informed, incoherent, and irresponsible. It's like a giant stream of insults, strawmen, and red herrings that make no effort to understand, let alone address, the underlying problem. Philosophy, as a professional academic institution, does not make progress. It solves no problems and it makes no discoveries. Even the very word itself, philosophy, is a terribly ill-defined concept. To demonstrate, just ask yourself right now, what is philosophy? That is to say, when I go out and take a bunch of philosophy courses from the philosophy department to earn my philosophy degree, what exactly am I studying? What knowledge or skills must I acquire in order to officially qualify as an expert in the field? What separates the study of philosophy from, say, the study of physics or art? How do we differentiate between a philosophical problem and a scientific one? How do we measure the difference between good philosophy and bad philosophy? You would think that academic philosophers might be able to agree on this stuff at least, but even this is a hotly debated issue. For instance, consider the classic platitude that philosophy is simply the love of wisdom. By that definition, who isn't a philosopher? Who among us honestly hates wisdom and has no interest in understanding the world? At least one university department attempts to clarify this doctrine by telling us that philosophy is an activity people undertake when they seek to understand fundamental truths about themselves, the world in which they live, and their relationships to the world and to each other. Okay, so if I go out and get a PhD in philosophy, does that really make me an expert in the fundamental truths about myself, the world, and our relationships? If so, then why exactly does the community have such a hard time agreeing on what those truths are? Why are they so terrible at rooting out the many falsehoods within their literature and just telling us the facts? In practice, a far more appropriate definition for a philosopher is someone who merely studies philosophy. Philosophy, then, is defined by the agreed-upon curriculum that all students are required to learn for their philosophy majors. It's a perfectly valid definition, and at least some university departments do seem to implicitly assume as much on their very own websites. But let's just be honest with ourselves about what this entails. Philosophy, for all practical purposes, is nothing more than a collection of arbitrarily assigned coursework defined by the undergraduate committee of your particular institution. In practice, that usually amounts to a massive survey of thought from culturally influential figures throughout history. So the next time I need help contrasting the epistemological views of Immanuel Kant versus David Hume, well then I'll be sure to consult a philosopher. But when it comes to determining which views are more valid, functional, or practical, then I'm afraid even the professional philosophers are just as unqualified as the rest of us. Again, all of this would be perfectly fine and dandy if not for the arrogant pretense that modern academic philosophers are the great lords of all human wisdom. They would like you to think that they're all out there probing the deepest mysteries of life, the universe, and everything, but that image is nothing but a pretentious fiction. Every month, this community publishes huge volumes of literature in prestigious academic journals, despite having no official consensus as to what a correct answer would actually look like, even if they ever found one. This is not a good thing. Hucksters, snake oil salesmen, and the outright incompetent are the only people who can possibly benefit from this kind of ambiguity. When a professional field lacks any clear criteria over what constitutes sensible work, then the inevitable result is going to be a lot of worthless nonsense. So even if philosophy were to occasionally offer some worthwhile nuggets of truth, it is almost impossible to find any of that truth without first digging through a gigantic mountain of useless rhetorical bullshit. Case in point, consider the famous philosopher Alvin Plantinga, who is widely regarded as one of the greatest living philosophers of religion today. Yet if you actually bother to read any of his writings, they're practically overflowing with some of the most asinine gibberish you'll ever encounter. The guy honestly wrote a 90-page essay in defense of the proposition that it is entirely right, rational, reasonable, and proper to believe in God without any evidence or argument at all. Not just any God, mind you, but specifically the Christian God of the Holy Bible. He even goes on to claim in his other writings that if you don't share his assessment about God's obviousness, well then sin must be corrupting your brain and literally making you stupid. As if all those Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus, atheists, pagans, and Jews across the entire world could only believe what they do out of idolatry, pride, and masturbation. These are not just some idle scribblings either, but widely considered to be Plantinga's magnum opus. You would think that this sort of grossly bigoted incompetence would earn someone the disdain of an entire community of expert critical thinkers, but no. Instead, the guy has practically been showered with awards, fellowships, and honors. Bear in mind now that Professor Hawking and myself are far from the only people to notice these problems with philosophy, and many prominent figures have written extensively about it in recent years. So it's not really a question of if philosophy has a problem, but how best to explore that problem and bring the field back to some semblance of respectability. It's ironic too, because the philosophers themselves are apparently the last people on Earth we can count on for that kind of resolution. Philosophy, after all, is just a word, which means there is no objectively correct way to define it and protect it. Any answer we give is necessarily going to be arbitrary, and there are dozens of competing schools of thought over how best to define the subject. Let's not forget that countless members of the community also have a vested interest in maintaining this lack of standards, as it allows them to essentially get paid for doing nothing. Nevertheless, if philosophers ever want to be taken seriously as academic grown-ups, then sooner or later they're going to have to impose a few boundaries. Philosophy, it seems, is in dire need of its own philosophy. It's interesting when you utter this phrase out loud because it actually provides a subtle clue as to what the word philosophy tends to indicate in practice, namely, the rigorous articulation of what stuff means. It almost sounds trivial when you put it in those terms, but if you know anything at all about modern philosophy, then you know that this is a ubiquitous feature of the profession. Not just mere dictionary definitions, mind you, but a relentless drive towards conceptual clarity. To demonstrate, consider the so-called philosophy of science. In order to officially call yourself a scientist, then presumably you accept the fundamental goals of science and you agree to practice its methods. Science is not just a body of knowledge per se, nor is it a system of doctrines to be affirmed. Science is a process to be followed. A philosophy of science may thus be defined as any description of what science is, why science matters, how science operates, and how to identify those who fail to do science correctly. The philosophy doesn't even have to be set in stone either, in that anyone and everyone is more than welcome to offer their own particular spin on the basic principles. It is tempting to complain that all of this may only be a mere philosophy unto itself, but at least it's a consistent philosophy that reasonably captures what people usually mean whenever they use the word. For example, the philosophy of education, philosophy of religion, philosophy of law, moral philosophy, art, language, sports, politics. Heck, even corporations have their own philosophies. It therefore stands to reason that the philosophy of philosophy, or simply metaphilosophy, should likewise explain what it is that philosophers do, why they do it, what value it brings, and how to tell the difference between competent or incompetent practitioners. So how exactly do you think that the community of professional PhD-level philosophers officially define their field? Simple. They don't. They honestly and truly do not know what it means to be a philosopher, despite decades of personal commitment to that very profession. It's weird, too, because it's not exactly that difficult to just observe a group of professionals at work and then enumerate the various tasks they collectively tend to engage in. The way I see it, most professional philosophers in the academic world are essentially just a bunch of cultural curators. Human beings have been debating the same foundational questions throughout history, and there is real value in cataloging the variety of answers which develop over time. In this context, it simply doesn't matter if the community is unable to pick and choose which views are correct, because the very idea of a correct philosophical stance is utterly meaningless. At best, we can only explore the perspectives of influential figures, articulate their claims more succinctly, summarize the various critiques, and then enable students to figure out which answers work best for themselves. If we like...
Are we close to a pause point, Kevin?
I think we can just finish the video at this point.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Okay.
We may further identify an applied category of philosophy, which is defined by the act of doing philosophy or merely philosophizing. Anyone can do it, and it's simply a matter of doing exactly what we just established. A formal articulation of definitions, goals, values, presuppositions, beliefs, whatever, followed by a thorough exploration of supporting arguments, logical implications, and practical consequences. Successful practitioners are thus measured by their overall degree of cultural influence, but I believe that we can also reasonably evaluate their merits by examining certain objective criteria. For instance, I personally think that good philosophers must clearly define their terms, rigorously formulate their arguments in accordance with established rules of inference, and then show how such conclusions are relevant to real-world problems. In other words, what do you mean by that? How do you know that? And why should anyone care? Again, this may only be my personal philosophy, but at least it's a qualified philosophy from an experienced professional within science and engineering. Just because goals and definitions are arbitrary, that does not mean anyone is free to concoct whatever self-serving nonsense they like. If you expect your ideas to be clear, informative, and compelling, then there are just certain rules you're going to have to learn to follow. If, however, you don't care about any of those things, well then by all means, go ahead and mash your keyboard with whatever vapid gibberish comes to mind. Just don't act surprised when the rest of the world tends to have a hard time adopting your conclusions. But who knows? Maybe I'm being overly simplistic. Maybe you have an entirely different perspective on how philosophy ought to be defined. That's great, and I would absolutely love to hear all about the many different nuances within competing schools of thought. But whatever views you have, can we please stop deluding ourselves under the pretentious fantasy that the so-called philosophers possess some kind of magical insight into the fundamental truths of anything? Academic philosophy is not about being right or wrong, but about exploring the questions themselves within some cultural or historical context. If that is how you view philosophy, then it is perfectly safe to say that the field is very much alive and well. If, however, you want hard, definitive answers, then sooner or later you're going to have to start imposing some basic standards. In that sense, I'm afraid to say that philosophy is most definitely dead because it was technically never alive in the first place. Science is the ultimate authority in that realm because science actually has standards for what correct answers are supposed to look like. Science, therefore, doesn't need philosophy in any direct sense because science is a philosophy. So until mainstream academic philosophers learn to impose a philosophy of their own, they shall forever remain on the sidelines as other institutions carry on the real work of research and discovery.
Fair. Okay, let me just throw things in, be right back, and be back in about a minute. I don't know if you guys need a brief break either, but I definitely need one. I've just downed about 3 pints of water and a pint of Guinness.
I'm fine. We can talk while you're away.
I mean, do you want me to leave it up and you guys can just hold the conversation, or shall I just throw it back and be right back?
Yeah, sure. We'll talk while you are.
All right, cool. I've got a lot to say on it, but yeah. Okay, I'll see you guys in a sec.
I prepare. AntiCitizen saying in the chat, I prepare myself for your favorite tomatoes. I
think he actually raises some interesting points here, and understandable points.
I mean, I will be very mean. Point are nothing new to me, because if you read any philosophy at all, you already read that before, and not to be mean to you, AntiCitizen, but I read that in a more elaborate way before by philosophers who hate their own field, which isn't rare at all. Like I think AntiCitizen would probably like philosophers like Wittgenstein, probably. To Cercle de Vienne, like a Vienna Circle, logical positivism, probably. He probably will like those kind of guys. I think he's more akin to what he thinks. He thinks that philosophy must be anchored and subsumed to science, and science is the model to follow now. And yeah, sure, maybe philosophy made that model a time ago, but why didn't it follow this model itself? And now it should. Or maybe, as Wittgenstein argued, philosophy is only about conceptual clarity, and it's only about language and juggling definition and stuff. And thus,
it's about untangling the language and the ideas.
It's serve a purpose, but it's like mathematicians. Like everyone can do maths, but mathematicians are better at it than everyone else. So they serve a purpose, but they are more instrumental to other people. They don't actually serve a purpose themselves, so to speak. Which is the same with the mathematicians, if I'm being very mean. Like, mathematicians don't do physics, they don't do chemistry, they don't do this stuff. They benefit other people that do it, but they don't
contribute to, yeah.
So that's
that sort of happens a lot in philosophy anyway. They start with the concepts, and as conceptual clarity comes about, it becomes something else. And then that field moves on with that study. Not all the time, obviously, but it sort of happens with psychology and things like that.
Okay, so you just missed me saying that I think AntiCitizen has affinities with Wittgenstein, Vienna Circle, and logical positivism. You just missed me saying that.
Okay,
not much, and we talk about that a bit.
Well, I don't know where you're at with the conversation, but I actually think that I think he raises some good points, if I'm honest. I don't necessarily agree with everything he raised, but I think that there's certain things throughout the video that are worth thinking about and are worth addressing. some of them, I think they might be a slight misunderstanding. Other of them are a bit like, well, yeah, you got a point. There was one thing though that he said about morality, and it seemed that he was basically saying that it was solved. And
yeah, I was going to say something about that.
He already acknowledged that this is probably going to be a bit contentious in chat. So I think he's fully expecting that to come.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say that we can look back and we can see how morality arose, and we can talk about the evolution and the way we evolved, how empathy was applied and all that sort of stuff. I definitely think that we have ways to say. Right, yeah, okay, we can see how morality arose, but I don't think we've necessarily solved it. We haven't necessarily got any indication of where the truth maker 100% lies. What actually makes something moral or immoral? Is there any truth to moral statements at all? Are they actual propositions? And I think morality is more sort of one of those things that we've discovered, like logic and numbers, except it's far more complex. So therefore, we haven't got the answers in the same way that we've got this is 1, this is 2, this is 3. So I think that bit was definitely missing the point of why people are still having conversations about morality.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, where morality comes from is just one of the questions that exists within ethics. There's so much more to it. Like, okay, if morality is just empathy, is that enough for a good morality? Because empathy can be kind of biased. Yeah. It can make us really good to our in-group, but it can make slaves of the out-group.
Most definitely.
And is it moral to have slaves? That's a very different question.
Yeah, and as we said, like, is there truth to morality? Is there some form of truth, and is that truth based on what the culture say, or is there a truth that's above opinion, or anything along?
Not
those
just
lines?
that. What is morality? Is it just a tool? Is it something that exists as a property of the universe? I mean, that's part of the problem of philosophy, I guess, in that. These are conceptual things that we have to come through.
Yeah, most definitely.
I think it was fair to say that was a huge overstep to say that it was solved years ago. Like, but I think that I mean, probably the origins you could make an argument for that, but I don't think, of course, that captures even remotely the entire field of what ethics is.
Definitely not.
I think we also have to defend that philosophy is not only relevant when it comes to ethics and philosophy and politics, because other than that, if we are doing that, we are giving up the arguments of logical positivism and other people like that, and probably AntiCitizen will argue that sure, you can keep that if you want, but when you talk about knowledge and stuff like that, stuff that aren't subjective, then shut up, because that's kind of giving up the argument, which I don't agree with.
Yeah. And I mean, that's one of the things, like, what is knowledge? I mean, surely it's something objective, but how do you actually conceive of what it is? I mean, we've already come to for thousands of years, it was just justified true belief, but then along comes another philosopher who creates a revolution. Yeah. And that changes the way we think about morality. Knowledge. So is there a closure principle? Is, what makes something finalized? What about Munchausen's trilemma? Things like that.
Yeah. And if you ever read like philosophers of science, like Hume, for example, you can see very, very well why philosophy of science is relevant to science. And people ask, well, what do you do for a scientist? Like, what do you do practically speaking? And that's a good question. One of those things, as mentioned before, is conceptual clarity. Like, that's the obvious one. Like, I heard about this, those philosophers that help biologists when it comes to stem cell ness, the concept of stem cells. and he helped clarify 4 different definitions that the people in the field were using but were not aware of. They were not aware that there were 4 different definitions because they only used the same term. They didn't notice a difference. It's like when people say the word racism, but they mean different things by it. Well, it's kind of the same thing. You need someone to precisely tell you, okay, you meant it this way and he meant it that way. So just to be clear, right? No confusion there. So that's one way that philosophers can be useful to scientists. That's the obvious way, and the way that AntiCitizen doesn't seem to have any problem with, because that's very clearly useful. So I think that's fine. And as for morality, he said he didn't really want to argue about that. Like he said in the chat that that's a different conversation, and I agree, because he made claims about knowledge and expertise more than morality, because morality is more complex and delicate.
It's a fuzzy idea, yeah.
Yeah, fuzzy. Same for politics, right? Politics and ethics are very close together. So, and like I said, it's very prescriptive, very normative. But science isn't supposed to be that. Science is supposed to be more descriptive. And philosophy, when it comes to description, is very different. So that's why he wants us to address that, right? Address our bad standards, so we call them.
So, I mean, coming back onto the standards, I mean, there are certain standards of what makes a good argument, the justifications, the different types of arguments, how they need to be formulated to be considered valid arguments, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, in that regard, I think there is a consensus. It just means there are some philosophers who are popular because they say the things that that is wanted to be heard by an audience. So you can think about some of the arguments, say like William Lane Craig or Alvin Plantinga made. Some of them were pretty terrible, right? But they're appealing to an audience, and I think all of us here would agree that they're probably not doing good philosophy in that regard, even though if you took them away from that standard, they might actually have the ability to do good philosophy and understand logic well. It's just that when they go into apologist mode, they are not doing good philosophy, they're doing theology.
I think I'll defend Plantinga a bit here, right? Like, I know this is a bit controversial maybe, but like the point here is that, yeah, first of all, it's true that as all people, philosophers are not immune to this, right? There can be bias in terms of what you want to be true, and then you argue in this way, and then try to sort of use the tools that you have at your disposal to argue for a certain thing, right? But like reformed epistemology is not like some like, I don't think the summary that he pointed out, although it was directly quoting him, and like as a very rough overview, I think it makes sense, right? Like to just quote Plantinga on this, but I don't think it was entirely capturing the entire sort of. I guess I know that probably people will hate me for saying this, but there's a lot of sophisticated thinking behind why you should accept, or why it is reasonable to accept sort of the Christian God without evidence. Now, I don't agree with that, right? I don't like reformed epistemology at all. I think there are many reasons to think it false, right? But that doesn't mean that there is not someone that went there and wrote a book on why this is a reasonable thing. And if I don't like it, right, then it probably means that I'll have to do some work and figure out what he's saying, first of all, and then where he went wrong.
You have to be able to argue against the argument to be able to show it's a bad argument.
Exactly.
Yeah, rather than just the conclusion.
If you truly do feel that Plantinga is saying a bunch of nonsense, which I do think.
I agree.
Yeah, I agree, honestly, right? Then it probably is worth looking at why he thinks it's not nonsense, right? And trying to figure out where he went wrong. So that just goes to show that philosophy is sort of core in this entire process, right? And the reason maybe why Plantinga has seen so much recognition and so much sort of even praise in a certain sense is because he took the whole question about sort of believability and added, like, he innovated on this front, right? In the Christian epistemological front, he put a lot of thought into this, and there is a lot of innovation in what he's saying. Now, innovation in the sense that this has never been done before in the same way, in the same methodological way that he is arguing for it, right? So I guess this could also be seen as some form of progress, right? Like the complexity and sophistication of this argument or of this sort of line of reasoning now, just with Plantinga's contributions, grew like a lot. And now we have a lot more to think about this in this area, even if you might think that this is bullshit in some sense, right? You still have a lot more there now to think about. And I think that is, in a sense, what I was talking about before, where you have sort of lateral progression, in a sense, about certain topics, instead of maybe sort of linear, although I do think, as Gettier problems and some other evolution in logic, for example, with paraconsistent logic and stuff like that, there is sort of progression in that sense as well in philosophy, but there is sort of also this lateral progression where you just have more stuff to consider in a specific way. And then, as Kevin said before, then, if that is sort of digested, then you can sort of cut to the current point of the discussion. And maybe the current point of the discussion is at a 50-50% spot still, right? But at least it's a 50-50% with like a ton of stuff already out of the way that has been considered and reconsidered and debated over for centuries. And maybe the reason why we are at 50-50 is because like the topic that we're discussing is is conceptual and has a very hard time, sort of being grounded in like, as science is, in something that is sort of empirical, right? So in that sense, I think this sort of captures very well my entire thinking on this whole conversation.
And I want to point out too a few points that AntiCitizen make, like, oh, we only study the influential philosophers. That's not true at all. And Micah point out that we are all biased. Like, for example, do we study science from Oriental countries? No, we don't. We don't usually do that. Do we study philosophy from Oriental countries? No. We don't study Eastern philosophy much. We can, but don't. Because we are all culturally and historically biased, first of all. And that's not true that we don't study any obscure thinker. I mentioned Malebranche, which isn't very known. But I studied quite a few obscure philosophers that my teachers told me are not usually taught in the canon. That's just because he personally thought they were interesting to think about. So yeah, there is a canon, but we don't have to stick with it, and we usually don't. Like, not everyone will see Hannah Arendt. She's quite known, but she's not always considered in the canon, even though she's quite known. Like, have you heard of Simone? No, Simone Wales. Simone Wales.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, but not everyone knows about Simone Wales. And Adam Smith, for example, everyone knows he's an economist, but have you read him in philosophy? I have.
No, he wasn't actually in my curriculum.
Right? We don't always stick to the canon, but of course, if you ask that to the average undergrad, he won't know, because you're taught about philosophy in your own university, and you think, oh, that must be the canon. But when you ask around, you find, oh, no, that one wasn't in the canon. It was just a preference. And that's the same in science too. Like, science has a very strict canon, but you can find the oddball that would say, oh, I want to focus more on that today, even though it's not necessary. Like, I had a teacher in my introductory class to metaphysics and ontology that taught us about metaphysics of time and space. That's very advanced, like very, very advanced. But she did anyway, and she didn't need to do that. And she taught that about very modern philosophers, like philosophers from the 70s. Like, that's very modern in philosophy, and in the 1990s too. So you don't have to stick to the canon, and it's not true that we only learn about the influential one. You can read any obscure thinker you want, as long as they are relevant to what you want to teach about. If I want to talk about ethics, I can stick to canon because the canon is very good, but I don't have to. Like, I read a lot of people that are not in the canon. Like, I read about people that talk about Israel, for example, but Israel is not generally talked about in the canon, right? I read about terrorism. I read about philosophy and literature. I read about a lot of things that are not in the canon. Some of those are because of my choice and my optional classes, but some were in my general courses, So, and I think they will agree with me that it's not like set in stone, and the courses is obviously different from one country to another and one school to another.
Yeah, I mean, I was looking at the Sussex Uni master's course today, and there's half the stuff that was taught in my master's course. but also a couple of other different things. So it really depends on who's at the university, who's creating the curriculum, who has knowledge in what subjects. All that makes a difference to what curriculum is taught at whatever university.
We're trying to involve more women, for example, now, because we know that historically we have been very biased against women. And now we're trying to find back those texts that were probably erased in history, like they were buried under other texts, historically speaking, and we try to find them back. Like I heard about this seminar about female philosophers of the modern century, the modern era, like the era of Descartes, you know? And that's interesting because we don't really hear about women thinkers of that time, but they existed. They just were not allowed to be, they were just not given a platform. Like, I remember this philosopher from the medieval era. She's a saint, Catherine de Seine, which is a Saint Catherine. You probably heard about it, right? Well, Saint Catherine is a philosopher, and she's a very religious one, and I don't find her stuff very good. But she's a philosopher, so we could study her if we wanted to, and I did in one of my classes, which was about atheism, I think. Oh, no, medieval philosophy, sorry. I get those confused sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, in my curriculum, we learned J.J. Thompson, Kathleen Stock, Carolyn Price, and these are all being introduced because, a lot of female philosophers are absolutely brilliant, but 50 years ago were sort of ignored.
Yeah. That's just a good example of curses evolving. Like, do we teach a lot about female scientists? Well, sometimes we know about Marie Curie, for example, but we have to take we are making efforts to introduce more of them into this cursus because we know the cursus was biased, and it always will be. Like, we all have our preferences. If I were a teacher, if I had the power to decide what is taught, of course it would be biased to my own preference. Of course it would be. How could it not, right?
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah. I mean, I really wish there was more Confucianism and Lao Tzu in my curriculum, but those are the kind of things that you could actually just go out and do independent study on.
I have to say, I mean, from listening to Philosophize This, they both came up, Dave, and it was very, very, very interesting.
It's very different to the Anglo tradition. It's more sort of practical in the way communities work and things like that.
But there's also some overlap as well. And
that's it. And there always will be in something
removed.
like philosophy.
Yeah, but people coming to these same conclusions when they're so far removed at a time where there wasn't the internet to steal the ideas from each other. And and
I suppose you could argue that shows that there is some kind of truth to be found. It's just how to go about finding it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's what we'd infer. Someone could always argue that there isn't. But, yeah. So there is something that's popped up in the chat, which is in relation to what Philip said. And I'm going to read out the comments. I know you've responded in the chat, Philip.
Yeah,
but I will. I'm going to read that out, and I'll read out your comment, and then we can go from there. There's also a subsequent comment on it too. So, AntiCitizen X says that's very confusing headspace to me. Let's congratulate Plantinga for introducing a giant pile of new bullshit. And your response here is let's congratulate him on providing new material for us to digest and dissect, because of which we can better understand why that line of reasoning is bad, which, by the way, is a personal evaluation on reformed epistemology. And Ricardo's got a question on this as well that actually says, did Plantinga actually do any new philosophy or just redress old stuffy crap in a new language? Would you like to address that, Philip?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think like a lot of what he argues for is present in the Christian zeitgeist in a sense, right? Like this idea that you can be justified in belief, in the whole conversation around faith in general, right? Like, so even if you don't have evidence, it's still sort of justified. But he put it like it's not just a simple translation. I think it's not as simple as that. I think he genuinely did provide a lot of sort of thinking behind that, and he attempted a lot to justify it a lot. so that it can be considered, I think, original sort of work on this particular idea. But yeah, I mean, as I said, like I don't have to agree with Plantinga, right? But I don't think that his I think his conclusions are sort of crap, right? But like I still can appreciate the thought process, is what I'm trying to say, I guess. I think it merits discussion.
It's better than just saying, well, it's true because it says it in the Bible. There's a bit more depth.
Oh, I just catch on. Plantinga is the Christian philosopher you referred to in the
Alvin
video.
Plantinga,
Yes.
Alvin.
I don't know him, so that's why I have nothing to say about
it. I know him passingly, right? Like he's well known for reform epistemology and some other things, but like mainly for reform epistemology. He did work also outside of philosophy of religion. But within philosophy of religion, that's sort of like his main. And like, to be fair, a lot of very bad philosophy is born from that. Like a lot of presuppositionalists really likes epistemology, so it's pretty bad to some extent. Like at least what came afterwards. I don't think he himself was this extreme, but it inspired a lot of people to come up with some pretty bad stuff. Which, by the way, is pretty. Like if we want to talk about consensus, I think within philosophy, presuppositionalism is not taken seriously at all, even among Christian philosophers, right? So like a lot of Christian philosophers will be happy to say that presuppositionalism is just not to be taken seriously. So I think this may be another point in sort of to consider when we talk about consensus.
And you have to love Plantinga because he's that old English granddad. He's got that thing going on. The voice and the tweed jacket and the pipe.
Oh, I think we lost you.
Lost who?
Dave. I didn't hear the last part.
I heard him. I heard everything that you said, so maybe it was on your end.
Okay, that's fine. Do you remember earlier, I think it was Dave that was saying that it's possible that maybe they have very good teachers and that his first curriculum in philosophy wasn't great. That's why he has a sour taste about philosophy now.
Mm.
Do you think it's possible that he had a more continental exposition to philosophy and he didn't like that type of philosophy? But if he had more analytical philosophy, like, for example, philosophers of language, he will probably like it more.
That's possible.
It seems to be more to his taste. Like, I think he will like someone like Searle or Austin. Do you know who I'm talking about, Dave?
No.
Philosophers of language, like talk about stuff like how to baptize, for example, is not just a word. It's not, you don't just say I baptize you or marry you. You actually do the action by speaking it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he called those elocutory actions, for example. But basically, my point is maybe you would like more that type of philosophy because it's very like rigid, structurally speaking, very logical, it's very, very sensible. Like it's hard to disagree with usually, and it's not like esoteric at all. It's very down to earth, if so to speak. So maybe that's what he wants in philosophy. But that already exists. That already exists. You just didn't learn much about it, I think.
Well, I mean, you could look at somebody like Oppie. Yes, you have somebody like Plantinga. Who's the other guy? Warranted Belief guy. Sorry, I'm kind of tired. My brain's.
I think warranted Christian. Wait a minute. Warranted.
But yeah, these kind of people are taught about in Aquinas, but you don't really hear Graham Oppie in current curriculums. So maybe looking outside of those things. I mean, Oppie is hugely popular in the philosophy of religion, but he's not had time to become part of the curriculum unless you're in whatever university.
Begins with an M.
There's a lot of good philosophy of religion. Like if you look at atheist philosophy of religion, it's pretty good. And if you look at theistic philosophy of religion, some of it is very good. Like I keep bringing up Leibniz, but Leibniz theodicy is pretty good.
It's like, good, yeah.
Sure, it's not convincing to an atheist because that's not the target of the book. But it's very interesting to see how you rationalize something like the Trinity, right? the mystery of the Trinity. How can one being be three at the same time, but still technically one being? That's very interesting to see someone actually try to defend this and rationalize it as a theist. Because theists nowadays, and I'm not talking, and I think that's something that people, especially atheists nowadays, find kind of irritating about theists, is that they don't try to argue intellectually about theism anymore. They don't like, not most of them don't like to do it. But there's still a few of them. Like there's still a few academic theists that will argue philosophically and theologically. But how many do it now? Not many. And who listen to them? Nobody listen to them. Like it's all Ray Comfort types now, morons with bananas, right? But that's not very good. We all know it's terrible, and even theists themselves admit it's pretty bad. You know it's bad, but they don't have anything else. So
yeah,
right?
I mean, pick up Joshua Rasmussen. You know,
Rasmussen is really good in my opinion. Like even Koons, is a masterful logician, right? He's like excellent logician. So like you have theists that like are really, really, really clever and really, really good in what they're arguing for. So like that is fascinating to me, right? Like trying to figure that out, to figure all of this out. And of course you can, like, I think the point here is you can go and be like, okay, this philosophy from a theist, is kind of interesting, right? And that shouldn't be the case. So philosophy is crap, right? Like philosophy, and I see that a lot of atheists do this, right? Like, oh, do I have to really engage with this stuff, right? With this argument? Oh no, I'm just going to discredit the entire field of philosophy because that's much easier, right? And I'm just going to argue that this is. I'm not saying that AntiCitizenX is doing that, by the way, or that this is his motivation, but I do see it often online. When sort of theists present certain arguments, it's much easier sometimes to discredit the entire field of philosophy than actually argue against these things. But I do find it personally very interesting, and I enjoy the challenge, if you will, of figuring out how to engage with these types of arguments.
Student says in the chat, it's kind of interesting how you mentioned earlier that no one can get away with contradiction in the literature, but now you're defending Leibniz for defending a contradiction. And I answer, well, if you read Leibniz, you try to prove it never was a contradiction, which is what philosopher will do, obviously.
Swinburne was the guy I was thinking of, not warranted belief, but Swinburne, yeah.
Yeah, because warranted Christian belief is, I think, Plantinga's.
It is Plantinga, yeah.
Was Swinburne a rational belief, or was that Plantinga as well? A rational theistic belief. And you just feel it's true, so you don't have to justify it. You just feel God exists.
No.
Was it
Swinburne
one of them?
is the main innovator when it comes to sort of non-deductive.
Non-deductive, yeah. I got the two mixed up. I'm very tired.
I'm surprised that not many theists defend the view of fideism nowadays, because it's very easy for them to defend that. Like the view that faith alone is the way to know God, and that reason is not a way to know God, and thus science and philosophy about God is kind of a waste of time, and so on. Like, why don't they try that avenue now? I'm surprised they don't.
I think there's probably, because of some pushback from the idea that for a belief to be warranted, it must be rational and things like that. So if you just say, well, I just accept it, it loses that sort of rationality behind it. I mean, there's the whole Kierkegaard arguments that it's not about rationality anyway. But I think today that's just not quite enough for a lot of people.
So we've got a few comments in the chat before we carry on with. I mean, I've got a couple more points myself, but I'll just read a few comments out. So we've got John from America. One thing I will always say, methodology and ideology go hand in hand, which can cause a system of biased beliefs and an echo chamber type of environment. And it's funny to hear a subjective mind to say that. And then he also says text-to-speech is bad, which is why I tried to decipher and say that correctly. And it's very, very easy to fall into an echo chamber. I mean, we've had a couple of streams on it. Well, Stream and Dave recorded a video about echo chamber and how we atheists can quite often be in those echo chambers ourselves, because we we do have a particular ideology that we go with, and I think, you're very right there, and you're very right to say you're getting into a whole other conversation. But that's the other thing. I mean, using philosophical reasoning, your critical reasoning skills and all of that can actually help you address the fact that you are getting into an echo chamber and the bad types of arguments and just accepting things because that's what everyone else in the group does, and all of a sudden you can realize, oh, hang on, maybe we shouldn't be just accepting this. Why are we accepting this other than that's what other atheists say, or that's the opposite of what theists say? Is there something a little bit more to it than that? So I definitely agree with that sort of statement. He says also, I think they're not going to teach us about other ways of speaking from other coaches because, divide and conquer. I'm not sure what that particular statement was referring to. Are you guys aware? I'm sorry, John, if you could clarify that one for us, I'll come back to it. Then Ricardo says, apart from modal logic, I'm not aware of anything else that should be taken seriously, but I might be wrong. I just don't think the gift of the gaffed is a good philosophic metric. Philip, do you want to address that one?
I mean, I don't know anything that should be taken seriously in terms of like the entire field of philosophy, or I'm not exactly sure what he's referring to.
I think he's meaning methods of logic.
Modal logic is like, it's about sort of what is possibility and necessity. Yeah, exactly, right? Like it's a build up on top of sort of like a more traditional stuff. It deals with different things, let's say, than sort of classical logic, let's say. It has like a few different operators, about sort of what a square and a I don't know how to say that in English, rhomb or something. Anyway, these represent sort of necessary and possible, and then there's sort of axioms about how these sort of interact, and then you can sort of make proofs out of these, and there are sort of various levels of axioms that are divided into different groups, and then you have sort of S4, S5, and so on. But I don't exactly know, like, why would that be the only I don't know if that's the only logic worth taken seriously.
I had the intermediary level logic, if you want.
I'm sorry.
I had a class on intermediary level logic, which touch on those topics. Have you had that class, Dave?
No.
You only had introductions.
Yeah.
Okay. I had the middle one, which is the one before the master level. After that, you get the advanced logic class. But the middle one does teach you about modal logic. It's been a while. Like I took it like not this winter, but like last fall, last year. I am looking at my folder about this class, which was online, so I have everything on my computer. Yeah, consistency trees, formal semantics, metalogic, modal logic. Oh yeah, modal logic. That's the one. So I just look at it for us. Sorry, we'll take a little one, but we can talk about it if you want. I know modal logic is very interesting because it teaches about it adds new modifiers like possible, impossible, probable, improbable, stuff like that.
Yeah.
So let's see. Axiomatization of system model system T. Let's see. Variable. This natural deduction. Yeah, sorry, it's been a while. If you want, next time I can revise my modal logic and we can talk about it.
Yeah.
But I do have everything for it.
I just want to quickly say that because AntiCitizenX pointed out modal logic, temporal logic, three-state logic, like some of these are not designed to compete with classical logic. Like, for example, modal logic, it's not designed to compete with classical logic, but there are some fuzzy logic and some other logics that do compete with classical logic. Or if you want to see it, you could see it as an extension as well. Although there are certain things that work in sort of like power consistent logics that does not work in classical logic. So yeah, there are plenty of non-classical logics. That's true. But
I love learning about those because they are way more interesting than classical logic. Way more.
Yeah, I love all of these. I mean, we did a stream on this where I went through sort of paraconsistent logics. So yeah, and the Aletheism. I love logic as a field in general.
Just coming back to the statement, though, I just don't think the gift of the gab is a good philosophic metric. I mean, is that supposed to be saying gift of the gab?
I think so.
So if you're saying gift of the gab, that's basically someone who has the ability to speak well. So, Ricardo, it seems like you're saying that modal logic is, the only thing in philosophy that you think is actually something that should be taken seriously, or anything that can be tied into it, and therefore, just being able to speak well isn't a good metric. And I'd agree with you that saying just being able to speak well isn't necessarily a good metric. I think that it's more to it than that. It's all of your justifications, and I think within philosophy, there's a lot of disciplines that should probably be taken seriously, and there's others that should probably be taken, I don't know. You look at things like aesthetics. They're quite nice to talk about, and they make some good points, and they help you think about things in a different way, but they're not necessarily going to be as powerful as a discussion on something like morality. So I do think there are topics within philosophy that are really important to discuss and develop, and others which are really interesting and can help us think about thinking in different ways, but aren't necessarily as important.
Oh, I just realized I can screen share, right?
You can if you so wish, yeah.
Yeah. If you want to see something about modal logic, yeah. Wait a sec. Where's one? No, not this one. Sorry. I opened way too many, so I will just try to close a bit. Okay. So should be this one, I think. All right. Do you see it? It's in French, obviously, because I go to a French university.
Yes.
But you see the graphic at the bottom, right? So just to tell you, V means true, F means false, as you might expect. And the rest, you probably recognize the symbols, right?
Yeah.
Did you? Hello?
Yes.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, you can hear it. I mean,
it cut a little bit. So as you see, this is a modal logic table. It says original world, which is W0, and then a possibility of world 1, all word N, stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
Probably recognize that.
Yeah.
And what's interesting about this is, as you can see, it says if something is true into original world, then it means there is a possibility that means it exists at least one world in which this is true. But if it's false in the original world, then it means it's false in every other world. Like it's assumed that if something isn't true in our world, it's usually not true in other second world, right? Like I forgot what all the sign mean. Like I forgot what the logins means and the square. It's been a while. I think square means necessary. I think.
Yeah.
And the logins is probable, right? Something like that.
If I'm not mistaken, it should be that way.
Yeah, but
either that or the other way around.
It's way more nuanced than classical logic, which is the point we're getting to earlier, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, would you say? I mean, especially if you're thinking about it in the form of a philosophy. I mean, would you guys say it's the only standard in that sense? Okay. So actually, that comment was he was saying that only about
square is necessary, diamond is possible.
Yeah.
Sorry. So that was Yeah, so Ricardo's qualified what he said, and actually he wasn't talking about philosophy in general. He was just saying that it was in relation to Platinga's work, which makes more sense, actually. So thank you for clearing that up.
Oh yeah, you're right. That was what the symbol meant. Sorry, I found a better graphic. That was the one I was looking for. This one, because there's the square of possibilities in it.
Okay, hang on, let me load that up.
Is it loading? Oh.
Doesn't seem to be coming through at the moment.
Yeah.
It's ended, apparently.
Yeah, I'm trying it again.
Have you tried turning it off and on again?
Yeah, why not? Oh, that sucks. It was working earlier. Maybe if I just share my whole screen, it wasn't the right one. Okay, this one should be good. Okay, so as you see, there's the squares possibility, which is way better graphic because sure, there's the necessary and friends, but you know what that means necessary, right?
Yeah.
Contingent means contingent, like that's easy to follow. And that's very interesting because you know like necessary P is the opposite to contingent. Like contingency is the opposite of necessary. It's not impossible. Impossible is contrary. It's not contradiction. It's the I just find this
necessarily not be.
Yeah. And I kind of forgot this class because you know it's like if you don't do high level math for a while, you just forget about it. So logic is the same. I just forget about it.
And I'm the same. I mean, I'm a programmer, but if I don't use a bit of code for a few months, I forget about it, and I have to look it up again and to learn how to use it. You know, sometimes it's really basic stuff, and I just forget how the function works until I read it, and then it's like, yeah. So I mean, it's the same with everything. You know, the brain conserves energy, doesn't it?
Frozen my end.
Frozen your end? Yeah.
Okay. Now it's back.
Okay.
I wanted to show you this part. It's in French, but I can tell you what it is. It's a deontic logic, which is about deontology, you know, moral logic, if so to speak. That was very interesting to me when our teacher talked about this because he said you can make logic systems about other stuff if you want, and that's a square of deontic oppositions: obligatory, forbidden, optional, and permitted.
That's very interesting. I've never seen this. That's
logic
interesting.
Logic with morals. I thought you find that interesting.
It's extremely interesting. I've never seen this.
This one is mandatory. This one is optional. This one means forbidden, and this one means permissible or admissible. That's a logic square about those variables.
Yeah, it's very clever.
It's great. It's great, right? It's great.
Yeah, very, very good. Yeah.
And I knew you'd like that because, well, you like talking about morality. You like logic. There's both.
This is really good. Yeah, I never thought about this, but it makes sense.
Are we going to get you interested in morality now, Philip?
Oh, I always was interested in ethics. Right? Like it's not like I.
Oh, it was Leon. No, I just remember
Leon
hated it, did it? Yeah.
Hated ethics. Yeah, no, I always liked.
Can you give the Discord link for AntiCitizen? Said you have a contact.
Yes.
Yeah, we can post the link.
Yes, I'll give you an ability to join our Discord. Give me just 1 second.
I just copied the link. And,
okay, yeah, just chuck it in there.
If you want me, I can send it.
Yeah, no, we'll just chuck it in the chat. Anyone who wants to join the Discord is more than welcome to. And AntiCitizen, I'd love to have you on for a chat. I mean, you mentioned something about morality. If you want to have a chat about morality in the future, it'd be great. I also see that you're saying that you've got to go soon, so thank you very much for joining us. I didn't expect you to stop by, and also for staying so long and answering things as it came up. And I actually think it helped keep our bias in check as well, because we said at the beginning of this, we do have a bias towards philosophy, and it's good having someone there who is taking the other side and perhaps explaining things in a little bit more detail. And well, what I meant by this was that. And I do think that there are a lot of things in your video that are worth chatting about and having a conversation about, even if I don't completely agree with everything you said. So thank you.
Even if it's a late boner, it shows interest, right?
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, so thank you both for the video and for joining us tonight. It was great.
Just one question. Do you think a logic system about morals, like I just showed you, like this deontological system like this, do you think that's interesting, morally speaking, to try to make logic out of morals?
Well, yeah.
I do think it is.
I mean,
because the author is saying something. He's saying that what's mandatory imply permissibility, what's forbidden imply that it's imply contingency. That's very interesting thing to say.
Yeah, this is very interesting to say.
Like if you look at this, like this implied this implied that, this is contrary to that, this or that. That's very interesting to me, honestly.
Yeah.
Oh, I'd agree, and I'd actually like to have a discussion about this in itself and put in some hypotheticals, right? Put some hypotheticals in and actually translate it into English and then back into the logic again.
Yeah, I could translate it into English because
I don't mean it being in French. I mean like putting a story to it.
Oh,
so,
right.
Discussing a hypothetical.
I could look up the author of this system, which is Von Wright. I don't know him very much, but I could look it up.
It'd be interesting. I mean, maybe not for tonight because we're definitely getting on time-wise a bit. But it'd be
like
interesting
for today, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, that could be an interesting topic. Exploring that.
Like talking about logic and morality, that could be fun.
Yeah, definitely.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Some of our favorite conversations revolve around those two, so both at the same time.
Yeah.
Just be like,
yeah, that's why I wanted to show you this before we leave, because we were talking about modal logic, and it made me think of this. So yeah, it was a fun conversation. So I did appreciate looking over the video, because what I still don't agree with AntiCitizen, I think it shows an interest in philosophy regardless. Just like Wittgenstein being critical of philosophy doesn't mean he doesn't appreciate it in his own way, right?
Yeah.
And to be honest, I think part of being good at a particular thing is being critical of it as well.
Yeah.
I mean, how often do we go on about scientism? People who idolize science, and they dogmatize it, they deify it, and I think the same can be said for philosophy as well. But I think there's a lot of people who are scientistic in that way that attack philosophy, not realizing that they're doing similar things in the scientific realm. And I don't think there's necessarily, like, some of the issues raised, I don't think they're necessarily issues. I think it's just a different platform and, a different methodology and not really the way we should be thinking about philosophy. But you do raise some good points.
Oh, yeah, you gave me lots of interesting stuff to think about the video.
Yeah. And I think there is a difference still between people who just, bash philosophy without understanding anything about it, and then people who actually do understand it a bit and then sort of are critical of it, right? Like, you can feel there is a different sort of depth there in terms of, the actual critique. So,
oh, yeah.
That's,
It's certainly a higher caliber of opposition than, say, Aaron Ra, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Like, I mean, someone who just says that, oh, this is mental masturbation or stuff like that, right? You can clearly see that they haven't ever,
I don't think AntiCitizen will agree, for example, that atheism is skepticism. I don't think he will agree with that. Like the idea that the rock theism thing. I don't think AntiCitizen will agree with that, because I don't think he's naive enough to agree with that.
Yeah.
It certainly shows a better understanding to some degree. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding on his part of philosophy, but you at least know about it more than the average person. So.
Oh yeah, he's clearly studied philosophy. Yeah.
I think as well, though. I mean, it's better than some of the criticisms that we've got from people in the past of like.
Sure.
Where we've talked about before that, so basically when you're asking certain questions in certain ways, you're effectively doing philosophy, and certain discussions that you have, you're having a philosophical discussion, and someone would turn around and go, well, if everybody's already doing philosophy, why do you need to study it? Academic philosophy is useless.
Yeah, everyone can run a treadmill. Everyone can run. So why do we need Olympic athletes, right?
Or as Liam Bright posted today, I already speak English, so what's the point in learning linguistics?
I mean, he was joking.
I think you have a good point on this one.
Yeah,
it's easy to overlook someone whose expertise is supposedly something that everyone can do. Everyone can think, but I don't think everyone can be an expert in thinking, so to speak.
Yeah.
And I think that's the thing. And yes, okay, there are some things you can point out that might be wrong within academic philosophy or education in general. There are so many issues with education. There are biases, and it depends on how good the university is, how good the syllabus is, how good the teachers are, and so on and so forth. That can really make a difference to what you're actually learning, what you're understanding, what you're absorbing. So
have the point of the video apply to any other field in education nowadays. Like when he says, "Oh, we only study what's influential," well, that's a very good argument that I heard about teaching history, for example.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
yeah, we don't learn about any events that aren't big. You know, we don't learn them in history. We only learn about the things that have influenced.
But some people do. That's called the philosophy of history, and I had a few classes on that about the idea that how we should teach history. Maybe we should interest ourselves more into the daily life of people more than just the life of great figures, right? That's an argument about how we teach history, which is in itself very interesting, of course. But you have a point that like this isn't just a thing about philosophy. Like we teach every science this way. Like the art science don't seem like that way because they are a bit less affected by it, but they're still affected by it. Like I said earlier, we teach Newton over other physicists because he's more influential. That's it.
Yeah. And I mean,
he wasn't more right. He just was more influential.
You mostly hear about Darwin when it comes to evolution, but there was others. I can't remember his name now. Canic, something like that.
Yeah,
who was also doing the same thing at the same time. It's just that Darwin happened to become bigger. Yeah.
And the thing is, at the end of his video as well, when he mentioned some things that he thought would be, just someone doing good philosophy, I think that's generally quite an accepted standard within philosophy as well of the difference between.
Is, yes.
Yeah.
So
that is.
So his standard that he has for philosophers is the standard. It's just that not everything is necessarily up to standard for different reasons.
He did philosophy as an undergrad, and the way we rate undergrads and lower levels than undergrad is very lenient. Like I'm actually, like I told you, doing an internship for college level, which is like entry-level undergrad for the English word to compare. And it's very, very bad. Like, oh my God, it's terrible. But my supervisor was telling me you have to be lenient because he never did anything like that. You're 17 years old. Of course, you know anything about this. So yeah, you have to be lenient.
It's the only reason I got away with passing.
There was one question that actually came in from Ricardo saying, what's the variable that quantifies the goal? I think that was in relation to the morality bit. Sorry, Ricardo, for missing that one.
The square of morality.
Yeah.
There is none because the deontology square was about moral action individually taken. So if you say, for example, murder, is murder forbidden, allowed, contingent, or necessary? Like, are you obligated to kill people? No. Are you forbidden for doing so? Yes. Are you? Is it contingent, like morally neutral, so to speak, or is it permissible? Like you can do it like permissible and factual, optional seems similar, and I agree. But I think the difference, when my teacher told us, was what is permissible is something like you're allowed to lie to save a life, for example.
Yeah.
But what is contingent is like eating an apple. That's contingent.
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't do any good or bad. It's kind of neutral. Permissible is something that can be bad, but is permissible sometimes, for example. Which is why it's permissible.
I mean, would that be, say, like a problem of dirty hands? You do a bad thing for a greater outcome. So it's permissible because you've done something bad for a bigger good.
Forbidden is something you never should do, and forbidden is like, can do like rape. Rape is just forbidden. Don't do it.
Don't do it, yeah.
And obligatory, mandatory is something you have to do to be a good person. Like, I don't know.
Getting your clothes dirty to save a drowning child.
I guess so. But you get my point, right? The four axes are well defined, otherwise they wouldn't exist.
Yeah. But good one to come back to. I think we should come back to that one in the future, definitely.
I will bring it up translated if possible.
Yeah, please do. It would help us, especially me.
I can do translation, but it's not as convenient as just having it in English.
Anyone out there have any more questions for tonight? And let us know, because we're gonna wrap up shortly. But if I go round, Kevin, did you have any final thoughts on the anti-citizen video?
I think I don't understand why there's such a push from AntiCitizen and other people like him, and not to be mean, especially scientism kind of fault, to anchor philosophy even more. Because even if we agree with it, like that theist is unrational, esoteric nonsense in philosophy. So what? Like, it doesn't. Not everything in philosophy is so. We already agree with that. And even if some of it is a bit gibberish and nonsense, so what, right? Like, a lot of some sciences are very bad, and we still tolerate it. Like, we know, for example, acupuncture is not considered a good science, right? Nobody thinks it's good, but we still tolerate it to some degree, because that's important to be tolerant of stuff like that to some degree. So even bad philosophy needs to be tolerated, I think.
Yeah, but even this esoteric sort of stuff, right, is ironically conforms to certain canon. It's going to use certain tools, like, for example, within analytic philosophy and stuff like that, to argue for the things that they consider to be true, right? So even there, you can see some sort of what could be called a standard, right, emerge, even though it is sort of, we would all agree that it is nonsense. You still have sort of arguments that are laid out deductively and all of that.
It's also a survivorship bias, right? We only see the books and the writing that survived the test of time. So we only see mostly good philosophy. But what about everything terrible that we never see? That's just a survivorship bias.
Yeah. What about you, Dave? Did you have anything you wanted to add?
Just that I actually found the video to be kind of interesting. A lot of the stuff brought up, I think, was incorrect criticism, because it shows a kind of misunderstanding of the kind of truths that philosophy is trying to get at. It's sort of like a category error. Not quite a category error, but
exactly.
Close to.
You read my comment, didn't you?
No, what comment?
My comment under his video.
Oh, no, I didn't. Sorry. But yeah, it's sort of a category error, because it's a different kind of truth that's trying to be gotten at. And we might not necessarily have the correct methodology to find that kind of truth, because the epistemological grounding is very different. So I think the criticism is kind of misplaced, but it's still very interesting.
What about you, Philip?
Yeah, it's also worth pointing out that philosophy is what is building the standards, right, that we then use to evaluate stuff.
Yeah.
So it's like a bit unfair to.
It's also why people like AntiCitizen feel threatened by philosophy, because they don't like that we are the one making those standards. We think we are making up an ivory tower for ourselves. Like you mentioned that before, like philosophers think of themselves above other sciences. and he doesn't like that. But I don't think of myself as above other sciences. I think we have our role in sciences. That's different. I think, like a janitor, for example, doesn't think of himself above every other employee, but he knows his place in the hierarchy. He knows that without him, everything will collapse. He knows he's essential, even if everyone doesn't acknowledge him. And I think philosophers think of themselves the same way. We know we're not respected well enough, often, or we're not very respected nowadays. But we know that without us, a lot of science will just collapse on themselves. We're still important, even if nobody agree with us.
I'm surprised. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think a lot of philosophy today is very interdisciplinary as well. And
I was just surprised to see him be like so, because my perception is precisely the opposite of his, right? Like, I mean, not about philosophers maybe, because it can appear very easily, I think, that sort of like if you're using technical language and stuff like that, I can see why people sort of dislike that sort of stuff and think that and feel threatened by it. But at the same time, I do think that we are in a period of time where it's actually the opposite, right? We need more people that are sort of aware of philosophy and that sort of value philosophy than the other way around, right? Like there is sort of more like of a crisis, I would say, with philosophical illiteracy than, the opposite. So I do think that, philosophy should be sort of taught more and explained better and sort of, put on this into the spotlight again, because I do think it's valuable.
Yeah.
Awesome. Right. Well, I mean, unless you have anything you want to add in at this point, I think we're pretty much done for today, aren't we?
Thank you for inviting me, by the way.
Oh, no, thank you for coming on. It was really interesting.
Awesome. Yeah, no, thank you very much, Kevin. It's been far too long. I'm glad that you can...
I hope we can do this again sometime.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, definitely.
Keep us apprised of your schedule and when you get some free time, when you next get a reading week or anything like that, and we'll try and do it. I mean, as you said, doing the logic and morality one would be a great stream to do in the future.
It sure will be, yeah.
And also, I mean, maybe if AntiCitizen wants to come on and have a chat with us, it'd be good to have you back here, and hopefully he does. Last comment from John saying, "This makes me wonder: are philosophers made or born?"
Is it nature or nurture?
Yes, it's definitely both. One of those two. Both, maybe both.
It's having no friends and talking to yourself about stuff you really want to talk about.
Awesome. Well, thank you, everybody who has watched the stream as well. Everybody who interacted in the chat, we love it when you talk to us. I do apologise. There were moments where I did let the chat go by for about half an hour, but we were deep in conversation, and sometimes it's hard to break it up to address your comments. And obviously, yes, thank you for joining us, Kevin. And as always, you too, Philip and Dave. I mean, you're just the furniture.
Oh, I see you three on Twitter later, so probably.
So you've been watching the Fresh Air Sci-Fi show. I'm Joe.
I'm Dave.
I'm Kevin.
Have a good night, all.
Good night. Oh,
that was quick.
Yeah.
No, those are really fun.